Dragon Age is an iconic Western RPG that holds a special place in my and many others' hearts. Mechanically, they are console-friendly party-based RPGs with time-stop mechanics and combat. Thematically, they are high fantasy tales of desire, temptation, heroism, and both platonic and romantic love. Culturally, they are a trilogy of games that have amazed and disappointed, have inspired adoration and controversy, have innovated and chased trends, and, perhaps most of all, helped establish alongside its sci-fi cousin series Mass Effect, the BioWare RPG. But above all else, they are Dragon Age, and they are incredibly special to me. So, I decided to revisit, and visit for the first time, the first 3 titles in the series. I'll look at each individually with a fine-toothed close analysis of writing, themes, impact, mechanics, and gameplay before ending on thoughts regarding the entire series as a whole entity. Before doing that, however, we need to look at the history and people that led up to the games. It all begins with the creation of a studio called BioWare. The studio was founded in 1995 by medical doctors Greg Zeschuk, Augustine Yip, and Ray Musica, as well as their friends and family members Trent and Brent Oster and Marcel Zeschuk. After pooling together $100,000, they got to work on their first game, Shattered Steel, a moderately successful mech game. It has some impressive features like reactive terrain, but it's the studio's next game that really matters for this video. BioWare's second outing aimed to be a faithful translation of tabletop RPGs to computer gaming called Battleground Infinity. After showing their early progress to their publisher Interplay, it was decided the new RPG would be rebranded to incorporate the popular second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. With that, Battleground Infinity became the critically acclaimed first Baldur's Gate. It ultimately took the studio 3 years to develop, and required 2 of the doctors to leave their medical practice and work on it full time. The hard work proved worthwhile, as Baldur's Gate sold over 2 million copies, seeing it rank as the 10th best-selling PC game in 1999. Its main impact, however, was casting Revivify on the PC RPG genre. Before Baldur's Gate, fans were understandably frustrated and burnt out by cheap, buggy, and lackluster games flooding the genre, especially ones that tried to capitalize on the Dungeons & Dragons license. But Baldur's Gate showed RPG fans what the genre was capable of, with care and adept usage of the technology at the time. But it also laid the groundwork for what fans expect of BioWare titles moving forward. It's almost impossible to overstate the game's impact and quality, but that's a topic for another video essay in the future. For now, let's move on to BioWare's next game, the action title MDK2. It was ultimately a success and helped give BioWare experience working with consoles for its release on PlayStation 2 and Dreamcast. From there, BioWare solidified its claim as an iconic RPG studio with the releases of Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Amn in 2000, Neverwinter Nights in 2002, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic in 2003, and Jade Empire in 2005. Honestly, an insane run of quality titles in just a handful of years. Then, through a series of acquisitions, BioWare ended up being owned by Electronic Arts in 2007. I do want to point out, though, that back in that time, EA wasn't as much of an all-consuming, soulless, capitalistic black hole as it is now, but it was well on its way there. This acquisition largely ushered in a new era for BioWare. For ease of flow, I'm going to avoid talking about their DS outlier Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood, because even one of my favorite developers couldn't make me pretend to be interested in Sonic. With that in mind, the era kicked off with a blast, with the release of the studio's iconic sci-fi RPG, Mass Effect, in 2007. This was followed by the studio's first foray into MMOs by starting development on Star Wars: The Old Republic in 2008. Then, 2009 brings us out of this video's introduction with the release of the studio's entirely original fantasy IP, Dragon Age Origins. Dragon Age Origins was released on PC, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. When it originally released, I played it obsessively on the 360, so for this video, I replayed it primarily on an Xbox Series X with backwards compatibility. When it first came out, Origins sold for $60 with the collector's edition available for $75. That came with a steelbook case, cloth map, soundtrack, and some digital goodies. Players who pre-ordered the game were also given an in-game memory band item that boosted experience gain by 1% and gave players 1 free skill point to spend. However, 2009 was a time in the games industry before battle passes, seasonal content, and stores of microtransactions. Instead of the modern hellscape that is long-term game monetization, game publishers at the time tried to fight the used game market that was bolstered by physical stores like GameStop and Best Buy, with so-called online passes. These passes would be included in new versions of games in the form of codes that had to be entered to unlock access to online multiplayer modes. This way, players that bought used copies would have to buy separate online passes to access the rest of their game, allowing publishers to monetize used game sales they previously couldn't, even if it was for a fraction of the cost. This was why games like Dead Space 2 and Mass Effect 2 had tacked-on feeling online features. Now, Origins didn't launch with any online features, though, so it instead packed 2 DLCs in with new copies. One included the exclusive Blood Dragon armor set, while the Stone Prisoner included a whole Golem companion and was sold separately for an audacious $15. We'll cover Shale more when we look at companions, but it is an interesting look at past slimy elements of the games industry, and how it even impacted single-player offline titles. One of the key features of the first Dragon Age is its Origins feature. Origins are effectively prologue sequences that kick off the main plot while fleshing out your character and giving them grounding in the game's world. I love this aspect of the game, and what it adds to each playthrough. One of my favorite aspects of more restrictive RPGs character-wise, like the Witcher series, is the immersion that comes from playing a character with defined relationships and history for the player to explore and learn about while they play. The Origins system helps bring some of that to the fold, while giving players control over the backstory they want to explore. Not to spoil things, but it's really disappointing that it doesn't make a return in the rest of the series. Now there are 6 Origins in total. 2 for elves, 2 for dwarves, 1 for humans, and 1 for mages. Let's go through the elves first. On the surface, elves in Dragon Age are a tad generic. They're tall, slender, are closely attuned with magic, and have their trademark pointy ears. Long before Origins, they were your typical fantasy elves with an advanced civilization, a close relationship with nature, and prevalent magic use. This lasted for countless years until the conquering nation known as the Tevinter Imperium destroyed their civilization and enslaved them. In the generation since, elves have endured the slow erosion of their culture, identity, and language. Even after the human nation of Ferelden freed itself from Tevinter occupation, the elves remain oppressed. In Origins, this leaves elves segregated into 2 types, the nomadic Dalish elves and the assimilated but oppressed city elves. When players play an elf, they also gain +2 willpower and magic as a racial bonus, but these are their 2 origin options unless they opt to play a mage. If players decide to start as a city elf, their story begins in the city of Denerim. Denerim is Ferelden's capital and largest city. Despite elves no longer being enslaved, they are controlled and contained by crushing economic oppression, racial violence, and segregation. In Denerim, city elves are restricted to a ghetto called the Alienage, except for day trips into the city proper to work. The story starts with the player and their cousin Soris on the day of an important Alienage wedding. The day is disrupted when a local lord named Vaughan comes to the Alienage to torment elvish women. This ends in the player's other cousin, Cheyenne, knocking him unconscious. Shortly after, the Grey Warden Duncan arrives to search the Alienage for potential recruits to his order, which we'll cover in the main plot. Duncan tells the player that he knew their mother, and tried recruiting her 3 years before without any luck. Later that day, the player arrives at the marriage ceremony, only for it to be disrupted by the return of Vaughan and a retinue of armed guards. They crash the party and kidnap all of the women in attendance. Interestingly, this is where the origin splits into 2 paths depending on the player character's gender. Female elf characters will be captured with the others and will have to fight their way out of Arl of Denerim Estate with some other escapees. Conversely, male elf characters will have to fight their way into the estate to free those captured. Regardless, the paths converge with the player and Soris exploring the estate to find Cheyenne on the floor in a room where Vaughan and 2 cronies are over her. It is heavily implied that Vaughan raped Cheyenne, but he still tries to buy his way out of the situation. If the player accepts the offer, they are paid 40 sovereigns, the equivalent of gold coins in like World of Warcraft, where there's gold, silver, and then bronze, that they have to stow nearby to avoid it being confiscated. If they refuse, a fight ensues that leaves Vaughan dead. Feminism. The player's choice has an impact on the state of Denerim when they return in the main story, but the origin always ends with the player being arrested for breaking into the estate. However, Duncan saves them by invoking his rights as a Grey Warden and the right of conscription to claim the player as a new recruit. This origin generally does a solid job of introducing the plight of elves in Ferelden and the dark tone of the game's world. It also has the interesting accolades of the male version containing the highest experience yield of any origin, and the female version being the best for speedruns, as it can be finished in less than 5 minutes even on Nightmare difficulty. Elvish characters can also choose the Dalish elf origin. Dalish elves are those that live nomadic lives outside of Ferelden society to try and preserve what's left of their ancient culture. They struggle to preserve the fading lore of their ancestors while traveling through forests and small clans. They frequently clash with humans that hate them or want to steal their meager possessions, but they live with pride and love for one another. The origin itself sees the player hunting near their home camp with their lifelong friend Tamlin. While hunting, the duo speak with a group of humans that reveal ruins they found that house elvish artifacts that they think the player might be interested in. But the ruins have the artifacts scattered throughout them, so the pair explore them regardless. Throughout the ruins, players fight some resident creatures, navigate traps, and slay a bearscarn. Deep in the ruins, they find a magical mirror that shows the player visions of a subterranean city. When Tamlin looks through, he is noticed by a dark entity, causing an explosion from the mirror that knocks the player unconscious. They then awaken days later back in camp after being rescued by Duncan, the same Grey Warden, and fending off a fierce fever. The player is also told that the humans they met earlier are planning an attack, forcing the clan to flee. Before doing so, however, the player is sent back to the ruins to search for Tamlin, who went missing after the explosion. Back at the ruins, they find some sour vibes and a bunch of darkspawn. Duncan also happens to be there so that he can deliver some exposition that the mirror's explosion somehow released darkspawn taint. The search for Tamlin is subsequently abandoned, and Duncan reveals the player's sickness is caused by darkspawn taint, making the Grey Warden ritual the only thing that will save their life. Again, we'll go over darkspawn and everything that means once we get to the main story, so just hang with me here. With that, the player becomes a Grey Warden recruit, and the origin is completed. Overall, the Dalish Elf origin is definitely the weaker of the two Elvish options. Its plot is generally basic and straightforward, while not really taking advantage of the unique perspective of the Dalish Elves. It leads into the Blight decently, but the conflict with the local humans is never concluded, making it feel like an afterthought and leaving the origin failing to explore its racial tensions. Tamlin does appear later once he is corrupted by the Darkspawn, which is interesting to see, but the origin story overall lacks the weight and grander scale of the City Elves option. Now, let's take a look at the dwarves. In Origins, dwarves are primarily confined to the subterranean city of Orzammar. If players choose a dwarf character, they start with +1 strength, +1 dexterity, +2 constitution, and a flat 10% chance to resist enemy magic. The magic resistance stems from two key elements of magic in the world of Dragon Age: lyrium and the Fade. Lyrium is a mysterious and volatile metal that can be refined to a silvery liquid. Mining and refining lyrium is extremely difficult, though, because it is toxic and known for spontaneously exploding. So it is only worked with by a low dwarven caste of miners until it is refined, stable, and usable by others. Generations of working with the material have allowed dwarves to build up a unique tolerance, but also prevents dwarves from becoming mages. This is because the exposure cut the race's connection to the Fade. The Fade is a dreamy, shifting dimension filled with strange landscapes and demons. The primary religion in Thedas, known as the Chantry, teaches that the Fade was created before the material world, explaining their connection through a barrier called the Veil. This connection is seen through people's spirits passing to the Fade when they die, most races going to the Fade when they dream, and mages that take lyrium being able to travel to the Fade for extended periods of time. Lyrium acts as a physical manifestation of the connection between the Fade and the real world, meaning that a tolerance to it is a tolerance to the connection to the Fade itself, keeping dwarves from dreaming or accessing magic at all. So when players pick a dwarf character, they have access to two origins as they are unable to play a mage. The two options are being a dwarven commoner or noble, but I want to start with the commoner origin first. This origin is set in Orzammar, with the player being a poor dwarf known as a casteless, meaning they are at the bottom of their cultural hierarchy, only having status above dwarves that decide to leave the safety of the subterranean to live on the surface. This leaves them having to turn to working for a local criminal lord named Barant, who leads the criminal organization the Carta, along with their sister, Rika. The origin starts with the player doing some work for him, namely killing a thieving smuggler and poisoning an arena fighter to fix a match. While poisoning them, however, the player discovers that Barant's fighter in the match is passed out drunk, so they don the fighter's armor and fight in his place. After the fight, the original fighter wanders into the arena, resulting in the player being arrested by Barant. From there, the player escapes and kills Barant before running into Duncan, who offers him a way out after seeing how well the player fought in the arena. It's honestly the worst origin in the game. I can understand wanting to keep most of Orzammar for when players return later, but the claustrophobic scope of the origin leaves it without much to hook the player or introduce them to the world. It also fails to take advantage of the player's prescribed sister to ground the player in the conflict. Instead, the origin story is neatly wrapped up at the start, even though the player does run into Rika later to see how her story was wrapped up. That interaction is little more than a single conversation, though. But hopefully the Dwarf Noble origin is better. This origin starts players as one of 3 children of the Dwarven King. At the start, the player was just given the position of commander, with their close friend Gorham being their second in command and a potential romance option. The player runs some errands before attending a royal banquet. At the banquet, their younger brother Balin tells them that he believes the oldest brother Trian is plotting to kill him and secure his claim to the throne. This obviously doesn't make sense under normal monarchy rules, but the dwarves of Thedas elect monarchs, so a younger sibling with experience commanding military units would definitely pose a threat. The player has no time to confront him, though, because they have to go off on their campaign in search of an artifact shield called the Shield of Audoukin. The player kills some Darkspawn, gets the shield, and then their return is determined by how they responded to Balin's warning. If the player said they would kill Trian first, they find themselves attacked by a group of Trian's men and Trian himself. If the player responded a different way, they arrive to find Trian already slain. Regardless, as the player stands over the corpse of their brother, the king and Balin arrive before Balin completes his scheme and levies accusations against the player, painting them as the murderer. As punishment, the player is exiled into the Deep Roads, subterranean tunnels that house the Darkspawn. The sentence means certain death, but Gorham is sent to the surface in exile. Before Gorham leaves, however, he tells the player to try and track Duncan down in the Deep Roads so that the Grey Warden can save them. The player obviously does so and ends up being recruited. Thankfully, this origin does right everything the commoner origin does wrong. It grounds the player in important world events, starts a storyline to resolve later on in the playthrough, introduces the Darkspawn threat, and gets the player invested in their character with an emotional narrative. Players are also able to meet Gorham later in Denerim, where they can see how his story turns out. It also adds depth to the main Orzammar questline later on. All around, it's a chef's kiss. Interestingly, human characters only have one racial-locked origin, the human noble. This origin places the player in the shoes of a young noble in the Cousland family that rules the town of High Ever. The Couslands are one of the most influential and respected families in Ferelden, with the player and their brother Fergus just starting to become more involved in the family's affairs. When the origin starts, Fergus and the player's father, Terran Bryce, are preparing to go fight the Fifth Blight. But that's main plot talk, so put a pin in that for now. While they're gone, the player is going to be watching over High Ever in their absence. At the same time, another noble, Arl Howe, is visiting, while he waits for his garrison of troops to arrive and join High Evers, as well as the Grey Warden Duncan visiting on his way to the coming battle. The player gets some exposition from all of them before being sent to go find Fergus. Along the way, they are diverted to go get their pet dog out of the kitchen, where it is killing rats and terrorizing the staff. The player's dog is a Mabari Warhound, a hulking pup that looks like a pit bull that took all of Sylvester Stallone's steroids. A very cool feature of this origin is that the Warhound is a full companion that stays with the player throughout the entire game. It even has unique interactions with other companions, gear, and a skill tree. After grabbing the dog, the player finds Fergus and tells him to start marching early, while their father waits for Arl Howe's men to arrive. When the player arrives, Fergus is saying goodbyes to his family. Good thing nothing bad happens in these origins, otherwise this might be setting up something sad. But that won't happen, right?
No! My little Oren! What manner of fiend slaughters innocents?
Anyway, once that's done, Fergus leaves, and the story jumps to the middle of the following night, when the player is woken by their dog growling at something outside their room. It ends up being some of Arl Howe's men, who have unexpectedly arrived in the night and are killing all the people of High Ever. The player is attacked, but manages to kill the attackers with their dog. This kicks off a gauntlet of combat that sees them joining up with their mother and killing to try and find their father. They eventually find him bleeding out in the same larder where their player found their dog. Bryce says that the Arl's men almost killed him, but he was saved by Duncan. Duncan then shows up with news that all of High Ever is surrounded and will inevitably fall. Bryce and the player's mother decide to stay and die together, while Duncan recruits the player as a Grey Warden, and the two spirit away in the night. The human noble origin honestly feels like the canonical opening for Origins. It is the best way to get the dog companion, ties the player into Ferelden's geopolitics, introduces the Blight, gives opportunities for more exploration with Fergus and Arl Howe later on, and leads perfectly into the campaign's inciting incident. I do think it's unfortunate that humans only have one exclusive origin, but at least it is one of the top 2 or 3 in the game. So to wrap this section up, we need to look at the Magi origin, and the crash course of pivotal lore for the entire series that comes with it. A running motif throughout the series is the conflict between the mages and the Templars, the militaristic arm of the Chantry. Mages are extremely powerful, with their inseparable connection to the Fade and the demons that live within it. Mages that open themselves to demonic possession, get addicted to lyrium, or practice the forbidden art of blood magic are capable of incredible amounts of destruction. To mitigate the risks of this, the secrets of mages are a closely guarded secret by a circle of elite senior mages. To enforce more brutal rules and make sure they are followed, the Templars step in. The Templars are religious knights of the Chantry that are specially trained to combat mages. One key part of the safety measures put into place is the harrowing, a final test before students become fully fledged mages. The test requires potential mages to enter the Fade and resist the temptations of a demon, an especially important aspect as they grow in power. Success means reaching a goal they've worked their entire lives for. Failure means being stranded in the Fade for eternity. If mages are deemed incapable of the test early on in their training, they are made tranquil, meaning their connection to the Fade is severed completely, leaving them without emotions or desires, effectively soulless. When the origin starts, the player heads to their harrowing. It brings a lot of drama right off the bat and creates a lot of mystery for new players to find the answers for later on. The harrowing itself also acts as a great introduction to Origin's world and mechanics. It shows one of the most unique aspects of the setting, has fun combat, and places a healthy emphasis on socialization, choice, and some riddles for good measure. During the harrowing, the player runs into a former student stranded in the Fade that helps them overcome a series of demonic encounters. At the end, however, the player realizes that the student is, in reality, a demonic ruse, and the player defeating it signifies their passing of the test. It would be nice if there was an option for the player to not realize that, but I also understand how the high stakes of the harrowing make that difficult to pull off from a design standpoint. After the test, they are introduced to Duncan before being approached for help by their old friend, Jawan. Jawan reveals to the player that his girlfriend, a member of the Chantry, forbidden from being in relationships, Lily, discovered that he is to be made tranquil. If the player presses him, they can learn that it is because of suspicion that he is practicing blood magic. But it is also possible to completely miss that detail, which is great. Either way, Jawan asks the player to break into the Mage's Tower's vault to find and break his phylactery, a magical item linked to Jawan that allows him to be tracked if he was to flee the Circle of Mages. Every mage gets one when they become apprentices, and Jawan and Lily can't run away unless it is destroyed. No matter what, the player agrees to help, but they have the option of reporting the scheme to the head of the Circle, First Enchanter Irving, who tells them to go through with the plan to catch them red-handed and be able to report Lily as well, ensuring the Chantry is embarrassed by the ordeal as the Circle. With that, the player breaks into the tower's vault and destroys the phylactery, with Jawan and Lily's help. When they emerge from the basement, Irving and the head of the Templars, Knight Commander Griagor, are waiting for them. In the heat of the confrontation, Jawan slices his palm and uses blood magic to escape, shocking Lily and making her refuse to leave with him. In the aftermath, Griagor wants to punish the player because of their role in his escape, despite Irving's instructions and protests. As you probably expect by now, Duncan comes in the nick of time to recruit the player and keep them from being punished. This origin overall does a great job of introducing the player to the game, and ties into a future plotline in the main campaign. It also sets up the player resolving Jawan's story later on, adding some interesting depth to the main questline at Redcliffe. All in all, I can't say enough how much I love the origin system. It really works to give the player some context for their character, on top of giving customization options as well. It combines the immersed benefits of RPGs with a defined protagonist, with a choice-driven customization of games like Pillars of Eternity. It isn't nearly as open as series like Elder Scrolls, but it's trying much more to bridge the gap between consoles and CRPGs, and the Origins do so excellently. There's a reason that the system has become fondly remembered as it is. Even modern titles with similar systems, like Cyberpunk 2077, don't execute the concept as well as the first Dragon Age. I think there's some key elements to this. The first being sheer variety. Origins boasts double the Origins as 2077's backgrounds, and they cover vastly different abilities, locations, and races to showcase every aspect of the setting that Origins goes on to explore in greater detail. The other key to Origins' success here is how they leave plot threads for the player to return to later on, whether it's a main plot line later or wrapping up a relationship. It gives you the sense that the world is moving outside of your narrow perspective, and rewards players that get invested in their character's whole story, including the opening. For my main playthrough for this video, I chose to roll a human noble warrior, so you know the drill. Nice brother, family dead, sad, cool dog, Duncan's my new papa. With that, we start the Dragon Age origin story proper, and head to Ostagar. Ostagar is a ruined fortress in the southern reaches of Ferelden. It holds a lot of symbolic weight as well, as it was the furthest south that the Tevinter Imperium of old ever got before its collapse. It is here that the King of Ferelden, King Cailan, plans to fight against a rising Darkspawn army to end the coming Fifth Blight before it begins, making Ostagar the birthplace of a second saving of Ferelden. Now, there's a lot to unpack already, so before moving on, we need to dive into Blights, Darkspawn, Old Gods, and the Grey Wardens. The Grey Wardens are an ancient group of warriors that work independently of powers throughout the world to fight the Blight. In years past, they were supported by every race, nation, and faction. But by the time Origin starts, it has been so long since the last Blight that the Grey Wardens are a mere shadow of their former selves. Before we understand the Blights, though, we need to look at Darkspawn. The Darkspawn are an ancient subterranean race of bipedal humanoid creatures believed to be entirely soulless. There are a few beliefs regarding where they came from, with the Chantry teaching they were created when mages from the Tevinter Imperium went too far. But Tevinter claims they have always existed, and the dwarves believe they originate from a progenitor broodmother buried deep underground. Now, the Old Gods need to be introduced. So in Dragon Age, the world of Thedas was created by a deity known as the Maker. When Thedas was created, the Maker started paying more attention to its inhabitant mortals, rather than the spirits of the Fade that she originally looked over, causing those spirits to grow jealous. Since demons are petulant beings, they started acting out by reaching out to mortals and convincing them to become their worshippers. These spirits would enter the mortal world as dragons and grow in power from the worship, eventually becoming known as Old Gods. The Maker grew angry at the Old Gods, stealing their spotlight, and ultimately buried them in the ground, rendering them dormant and powerless. But what else is underground for 500 points? Darkspawn. When the bastards are able to find a dormant Old God, they corrupt it with their dark power known as the Taint, turning it into an archdemon and starting a blight. During blights, the Darkspawn are led by an archdemon to swarm the surface world of Thedas to spread their corruption and try to finally kill all of the mortals that the Old Gods hate so much. The only way to stop a blight is to kill the archdemon behind it. At the time of Origins, the 5th recorded blight is just beginning, which brings us back to Ostagar. At Ostagar, King Cailan and his right-hand man, Tairn Logain Mac Tyr, are preparing to fight the Darkspawn, and are expecting the Grey Wardens when they arrive. The player arrives with Duncan to find a young Grey Warden Alistair there, with 2 other new recruits. Before the battle with the Darkspawn, Duncan wants to induct the player and both other recruits into the Order, through a ceremony dubbed the Joining. To do so, they need to venture with Alistair into the nearby Kokari Wilds, to kill Scout Darkspawn, and collect 3 vials of their blood. While out there, Duncan also asks them to grab old Grey Warden treaties that are possibly being kept in the ruins of an old Warden fort nearby. The Kokari Wilds are a southern region of swamps and forests that are home to an unsettling low fog, dozens of strange and dangerous creatures, and a people known as the Chastened, vagabond tribesmen that go back to the Wild's ancient history. In this area, the player explores, fights a ton, and can complete some side quests. I want to talk about how combat works in its own dedicated section later on in the video, but now is a good time to look at how Origins' party system works. The majority of time in Origins, the player is accompanied by their party, consisting of up to 3 companions. While some players choose to play through the game without a party at all for additional challenge, it is completely intended to be played entirely with that party in place. I'll also take a close look at each party member in its own section, so suffice it to say for now that each companion brings a unique flavor to the game. They have their own builds, can be talked to at any time to hear their thoughts and history, can be played as during combat, and make comments and judgments in reaction to the player's decisions. Ostagar and the Kokari Wilds largely function as the second half of the game's tutorial, so the other recruits in Alistair serve as the player's first fully realized party that they can interact with and equip with new gear. With the group assembled, the player slaughters their way through the wilds, eventually collecting the Darkspawn blood and reaching the old Warden fort. Once there, they discover the treaties are missing, which makes a lot of sense as it has been centuries since they were left there unattended. Luckily, a witch appears in what is one of the most ridiculously revealing designs I have ever seen. And I'm not calling it ridiculous just to compensate for the fact that middle school me fell in love with her immediately because of it. She introduces herself as Morrigan, and the player's companions are instantly wary of the powerful witch, especially Alistair, who was training to be a Templar before joining the Grey Wardens. Regardless of how the player responds to Morgan, she tells him that her mother, Flemeth, a fabled witch known as the Witch of the Wilds, has been protecting the treaties in case the wardens came looking for them. Despite all of their reservations, the party agrees to go talk to Flemeth to try and get them. The interaction is inherently awkward and filled with some great tension, as the player sees opposing perspectives and lifestyles clash in front of them, providing a great introduction to the game's varied cultural landscape. In the end, the player is given the treaties, and they head back to Duncan at the war camp to undertake the joining. At the start of the joining, Duncan reveals that every Grey Warden must ingest some Darkspawn blood, creating a connection that allows them to sense Darkspawn presence and fight them as well as they do. It also helps explain how they are specialized to fight blights while still being able to recruit anyone, allowing the Order the flexibility to include a range of different player character types. However, the ritual does have a high mortality rate, which the player witnesses firsthand as the taint kills the first recruit to drink it. This causes the second to freak right the hell out and draw his sword, only to be stabbed and killed by Duncan. I'm sure their death comes as a surprise to you, since I haven't bothered to say either of their names in this video. However, the moment of Duncan killing the second recruit feels very off to me. I like the idea of the sanctity of the Grey Wardens being closely and severely guarded, or the Order being explored as a morally grey organization, requiring the player to wrestle with the very institution that gives them their authority and power. But that doesn't happen. The Order itself is never questioned, but only functions as a nondescript entity that the player defines through their actions. This works fine, but does ultimately feel like a missed opportunity, and it makes Duncan slaughtering a scared recruit feel anachronistic with the player first approach the game takes to defining the Wardens during the rest of the game. Then it is the player's turn to drink the Darkspawn blood. This gives them feverish visions of the Blight and the archdemon that leads it. The player falls unconscious, only to wake up a full Grey Warden, before attending a council to strategize for the coming battle. The player gets to voice their opinion a little during the sequence, but ultimately to no effect, which works here because they were only just became a Warden like a day ago. Ultimately, the plan is for the glory-hungry King Cailan to lead the vanguard, along with Duncan, to attack the Darkspawn head-on. Meanwhile, the player and Alistair will watch nearby from the Tower of Ishtal, where they are to light a beacon when the main forces clash, signaling for Loghain to flank the Darkspawn with a secondary force. The battle comes with a cutscene straight out of The Lord of the Rings, and the player has to fight their way up the tower to the beacon. There's a mini-boss, the beacon is lit, and then Loghain retreats instead of charging, leaving Duncan, King Cailan, and the lion's share of the royal army to be overwhelmed and butchered. The player and Alistair witness it all before being overrun by the Darkspawn and the scene fading to black. The player and Alistair both awaken back in Flemeth's hut in the Kokari Wilds. The two realize that they are the only Grey Wardens left in Ferelden, and they shoulder the responsibility of command. Flemeth supports this notion because she knows she wouldn't survive the Blight on her own. so she sends Morgan with them despite Alistair's issues with the idea. The party then leaves for the nearby town of Lothering, which serves an introduction to the game structure from there on out. Before that, though, the player is shown a cutscene set in Denerim. The scene shows Loghain revealing the disaster at Ostagar, putting the betrayal on the Grey Wardens and placing a bounty on the heads of any surviving members of the Order. In the interim, Loghain names himself as ruling regent until a landsmeet can be held to select a new king, since King Cailan was without heirs. The player is also shown the reactions of the assembled nobles and their building dissent over Loghain's blatant grab for power, which starts whispers of a growing civil war. When the player arrives at Lothering, they are confronted by a small group of bandits, preying on refugees fleeing the advanced Darkspawn forces. This interaction is one of the first real decisions the player gets to make. When the bandits approach the player, they can pay them to avoid the danger, can try to talk them out of it, or can just start a fight. If the player doesn't kill the bandits, they also have the option to report them to the guards in Lothering, although the guards are far too busy dealing with a flood of refugees, straining the town's limited space and resources. Interestingly, all of the content in Lothering is actually side content. It is completely viable for the player to walk straight through the town without seeing a single megabyte of it. However, the player is able to recruit 2 party members in the town. The first is Leliana, a sister of the Chantry and a rogue that wants to help the Warden after receiving a vision from the Maker. The second is Sten, a prisoner Qunari that can be released into the Warden's custody because of the likelihood of him dying while trying to stop the Blight. The Qunari are a stern humanoid race that normally stay secluded on their home islands, but little information is given about them in Origins, so I think I'll save exploring their lore until the video for Dragon Age 2, as they play a much larger role in it. Once the player leaves Lothering, the main quest starts in earnest, with the game's map opening up to them. The player has the option to pursue each Grey Warden treaty in the order of their choosing, a plot structure BioWare also employed for Mass Effect. The structure is better integrated here, though, as they are all connected through narrative and character ties that makes them play naturally into one another, rather than being a list of disparate objectives. The player needs to go to the Tower of the Circle of Mages, the town of Redcliffe, the Dwarven city of Orzammar, and the Dalish elves of the Bracilian Forest. You can do them in any order, but I'm going to go through each one in the order I played through them during my playthrough. After leaving Lothering, Alistair suggests heading to Redcliffe first, because he has history with its ruler, Arl Eamon. So I decided to head there. Redcliffe is one of the most prosperous towns in Ferelden, sitting next to Lake Calenhad in the shadow of the ancient Castle Redcliffe. While traveling to the town, the player is stopped for a random encounter, which is a system I love, so let's talk about those real quick. Origins is an open world, instead allowing players to select zones from an overworld map to travel to, represented by a trail of dripping blood and a nice edgy touch. While traveling, there is a chance the player's party will get taken out of traveling for an encounter. Heavily inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, these random encounters typically pit players against a small group of enemies for a brief combat encounter and a small doling of loot and experience. What really makes them stand out are when they aren't so random. Throughout a playthrough, these encounters will progress quests, kick off dialogue with party members, or even introduce characters. These seem like small additions, but it helps them feel unpredictable and fleshes the world out to feel more lived in and grander in scale than its zones would on their own. In this particular random encounter, the player is approached by Alistair. During the conversation, Alistair reveals that not only was he raised by Redcliffe's Arl, but he is also a bastard child of King Merrick, the father of King Cailan, meaning that he has a strong claim to the now vacant throne. The player can react to this in a few ways, but so far he's been chill, so we don't make a big deal out of it. Upon arriving at Redcliffe, the player is approached by Tegan, the Arl's brother and an ambassador to the neighboring nation of Orlais. He reveals to the party that Redcliffe is struggling, as Eamon has fallen ill and is in a coma, as well as the village being swarmed by undead creatures nightly for unknown reasons. Now, the player doesn't need to help defend the town that night, but we do because it feels like what a noble warden would do. After fending off waves of undead, Arl's wife, Isolde, appears from inside the castle. She delivers some more exposition, revealing that a mage hired to tutor her son Connor is to blame for poisoning the Arl. She says the mage was captured, but that the rest of the castle, except for herself, Connor, and Eamon, were killed. She was only let out of the castle to try and find someone to help Connor, who has somehow caused the undead scourge in the village. For this purpose, she takes Tegan inside while the player sneaks in through the dungeons to figure out what is going on. Quickly after entering the dungeons, the player finds Jawan. Yes, the same Jawan from the Mage Origin, which gives Mage Wardens a fun interaction, who is locked inside a cell. He easily confesses to poisoning Eamon and even reveals that Loghain sent him to do so in exchange for a pardon of Jawan's conviction as a practicing blood mage. To do so, he infiltrated the castle by being hired to tutor Connor, who has magic capabilities that Isolde wanted to hide to keep him from being sent to the Circle of Mages. Jawan also claims that he doesn't have anything to do with the undead scourge plaguing the town, and he offers to help the player deal with it if he is set free. Here, the player can kill Jawan, set him free and tell him to run away, set him free but tell him to stay and help, or they can just leave him in his cell for as long as they want. The player's decision here ultimately plays into the quest's resolution, but we'll cover that when it comes up. For now, we let him go, but instruct him to help deal with the undead, which garners mixed reaction from our party. From there, the player explores and fights their way through the castle, can complete some small side quests, and can find a fun detail that allows players to get help from some of the guards they saved in the attack that night to help them during a difficult combat encounter. Eventually, they reach the second floor of the castle, where they discover that Connor has been possessed by a desire demon, and that Tegan has become mind-controlled by it as well. Tegan then leads a group of controlled guards in an attack on the player, but once they are defeated, Connor runs away to hide. Here is where Jawan can come into play. If the player left Jawan in his cell, or told him to stick around after setting him free, Jawan is brought into the conversation with Isolde and the now-freed Tegan to decide what to do about the demon. Jawan says that while killing Connor is the safest bet, he can use a blood magic ritual to send a mage into the Fade, allowing them to kill the demon in its home realm and leaving Connor safe. However, such a powerful ritual requires a human sacrifice to fuel it. Otherwise, the player can decide to kill Connor, or go and ask the Circle of Mages for help, as long as they choose their side during the Circle's main quest. Going to ask the Circle for help allows the player to send a mage into the Fade without a sacrifice. So now, let's break each one of these options down. If the player decides to kill Connor, the party member Leliana will try to push back if she is present, but the player can persuade her to do it, or just do it without her approval. The fight takes place in the Arl's bedroom, with the Desire Demon possessing Connor fully revealing itself during it. The demon uses a bunch of area of effect spells that can deal a ton of damage to multiple party members if you aren't careful, but if you just keep moving, you'll be alright. Once the demon is defeated, it recedes back into Connor. At this point, Isolde runs into the room and begs for her son to be spared, but it's too late for the player to change their mind. So they can knock Isolde out and kill Connor, can let Isolde kill him, or can insist on killing Connor themselves. Both other options see the player sending a mage into the Fade to kill the demon there. If the player opts to use Jawan's ritual, Isolde insists on being the human sacrifice, and the transported mage is injured in the process. If the player already helped the Circle of Mages, they can instead recruit their help and send either Jawan or Irving into the Fade instead of the player, Morgan, or a companion named Wynn, which we'll get to later. This section of the Fade is little more than a series of hallways and some basic fights, but it still enjoys the great aesthetic of the Fade to help keep it engaging. Once the Desire Demon is defeated, it attempts to bribe the player to allow it to stay in Connor's body, but only if the Warden is the one in the Fade. The bribe options are unlocking the Blood Mage specialization, +1 talent and skill point, +20 reputation with a single companion, and sex. I'm ashamed to say that as a kid I chose to sex down a demon, but the option now seems like an odd one out. I can't decide if I love it as a peak example of video games catering to young adult men and mocking them by giving them no in-game bonuses for listening to their boner, or if I hate it because of how low effort and try-hard it feels. If the player can pass 2 hard intimidation checks, however, they can force the demon to leave and still get a bribe. So at least you can roleplay being so good in bed that you exorcise a child by fucking a demon away. If you're keeping track of my playthrough, I was planning on going to the Circle of Mages for help, but I accidentally walked into R's room and started the fight with Connor, and I ain't no save scummer, so I killed the little bastard. After dealing with the demon, the player can either have Jawan killed for his crimes or can leave him imprisoned until Arl Eamon wakes up. To wake him up, the player has to find a religious relic known as the Urn of Sacred Ashes, which ties into another main quest, so that's a perfect segue if I've ever written one. Before we get into it, we need to cover what the Urn of Sacred Ashes is. The Urn of Sacred Ashes are the cremated remains of a religious prophet known as Andraste. There is a lot of history and lore surrounding Andraste that isn't important to go over right now, but what matters is that she began as a slave in the Tevinter Imperium before becoming a prophet of the deity known as the Maker. She eventually became the spiritual wife of the Maker, and her teachings laid the foundation of the modern-day Chantry, after she was burned at the stake for leading a resistance war against the Tevinter Imperium. The Urn of Sacred Ashes quest sees the player hunting down a mythical relic that could be the only way to save Arl Eamon's life. However, the player can also start it by hearing about a fallen Templar, which is a fun detail. Either way, the player travels to Denerim to talk to Brother Genetivi, who is said to know something of the Urn's whereabouts. Genetivi's house is in the market district of the capital, so we head there and find that he is away thanks to his servant Waylon. However, Waylon seems a little...
On all of us. Some things are not meant to be found. I know that now.
Well, like that. So we get suspicious. From here, the player has a couple options to dig a bit deeper into what is going on. The first is to investigate more of the house, discovering the corpse of the real Waylon in the process. The player can also deduce Waylon's identity with enough cunning and confront him. Otherwise, the player can travel to the spoiled princess on the shore of Lake Calenhad and talk to the innkeep there. He can be pressured into revealing that a mysterious they are watching the inn for anyone who asks about Genetivi. When they leave, the player is ambushed by a mob of cultists. Regardless of which path the player follows, they end up able to thoroughly search Genetivi's house, finding his research notes that point toward a small village of Haven, although they have to kill the imposter Waylon on the way out. From there we head to Haven, which, no surprise, is also sus as hell. When the player approaches, they are stopped by a guard that warily advises the party heads on their way. However, he can be convinced to allow the player access to the town store to do some trading. Entering the town with Sten in your party starts a fun scene, but we'll talk about that in the party member section. After looking around for a bit, Haven starts seeming like a whole town of imposters with bloody altars, religious extremism, and a child that can be persuaded to give the player a finger bone. Overall, the sequence is really sick. It creates an ominous atmosphere that is effortlessly effective, and is open enough for players to explore it and find their own way through with any combinations of interactions, far too many to cover here. Regardless, the end result is getting attacked by the villagers and hidden cultists. The town also leads the player to the town's chantry, where the chief imposter, Father Eric, has manipulated and led the village from the dais. After killing Eric and his guards, the player searches his body for a cultist medallion. The player then also finds a hidden door with Brother Genetivi behind it. He tells you about the village's fall to fanaticism, as well as saying he tracked the urn to a nearby ruined temple that your sparkly new cultist medallion just so happens to open the door of. The player can opt to take Genetivi there with them, or convince him to return to Denerim, but either way the ruined temple is up next. The ruined temple is a pretty straightforward dungeon made up of a line of rooms with branching wings that hold keys required to progress. The ruins are filled with groups of cultists, and even have some side quest objectives for good measure. The ruins eventually lead to a series of naturally occurring caverns that just so happen to be filled with drakes and wyrmlings, giving us our first look at a dragon-esque enemy. These fights are pretty challenging, but the drakes do drop scales that can be used to craft a great light armor through the Drake Scale Armor side quest. Eventually, the caverns lead to the cult's leader, Father Colgrim. After slaying some cultist guards, the player gets the opportunity to talk to him. He fills the party in on some lore, revealing that the cult is actually an ancient religious order that was created to defend the sacred urn. However, he claims that Andraste has actually been reborn, so he offers the player a way to serve the reborn deity. Colgrim says that in exchange for taking some of Andraste's blood and dripping it into the ashes, the cult will forget the player's transgressions against it. If at any point during the talk the player contradicts or questions Colgrim, it turns into a fight, a great way to show his authoritarian delusions. Whether the player opts to accept Colgrim's offer or kills him from there, they go to the mountaintop. There they are shown the cult's Andraste, a living high dragon. Dragons are a very rare sight in the world of Thedas, after almost being hunted to extinction by specialized hunters. In the setting they are extremely powerful, however, with intelligence and magical powers that are thought to be even greater than that of humans. If helping Colgrim to defile the ashes, the player is able to pass past the high dragon unmolested. If not, the player can fight the dragon, or return later to kill it once they are a higher level and more comfortable with the challenge. Afterward, the player reaches a section called the Gauntlet, a temple of a series of tests to prove one's rights to obtain the urn. One detail I love here is the conversation the player has with the statue at the Gauntlet's entrance. It interacts with each party member to reveal some great details regarding their backgrounds and give some emotional beats as well without fully spoiling their stories. The Gauntlet itself is split into 4 trials. The first is a room with 8 ephemeral figures from Andraste's past. Each one has a riddle for the player to answer with an easy combat encounter as punishment if they get it wrong. This section is the Gauntlet's weakest, but I think it is more of a problem of riddles in video games in general. With how Dragon Age's dialogue works, the game is required to give the player optional answers, which takes away the challenge of a riddle in the first place. If you can see potential answers for a riddle, and know that one of them is the correct option, it is relatively easy to consider each option with reason and deduce the correct one. It completely removes the challenge of thinking of the riddle's answer for oneself. The only way to even see one of the easy combat encounters is if you choose the wrong answer on purpose. The second part is a fight with shadow clones of the current party. The concept of the fight is a bit cliche, but it is still fun, even though it is usually easy due to the combat AI struggling to run a player party effectively. The third portion of the gauntlet is a bridge puzzle that there honestly isn't anything to say about. It's straightforward and just takes a little bit of time. The gauntlet then finishes with a final riddle that works better than the ones in the first section, because it doesn't have to list answers for the player. Instead, it uses the game's actual mechanics and is answered by the player's actions, making it work much better in the format of a video game. Once the player reaches the urn, they can either take a pinch of them or defile them for Colgrim, unlocking the exclusive Reaver specialization that we'll cover later on. Interestingly, even if you defile the ashes, you take a pinch of them first, so that you can always save Arl Eamon. If the player doesn't taint the ashes, they have to fight Colgrim on their way out if they didn't before, but if they taint them, they support the cult and leave undisturbed. The last choice to make for this quest comes as the player leaves the area and runs into Brother Genitivi. Genitivi is ecstatic about the Urn of Sacred Ashes finally being found, and he expresses his excitement about telling the world where it is so that more people can benefit from its powers. The player is able to try and dissuade him from doing so, but ultimately the only way to stop him is by killing him in cold blood. If you leave him alive to tell the world, though, he also gives you a Master Dwemer rune. This final choice regarding the Urn of Sacred Ashes highlights one aspect of what makes Dragon Age Origins writing so successful: layering. Almost every quest in Origins has multiple choices throughout it to explore the various aspects and perspectives of each element, providing a more in-depth and thoughtful experience. Using this quest as an example, the Urn of Sacred Ashes acts as a way for the game and player to explore the concept of faith. The Urn's very existence is questioned by numerous characters leading up to the quest and in its earliest stages. This establishes that even in a world of magic and fantastical creatures, the existence of its religious icons is a subject of hot debate. While ultimately the player has to discover that the Urn of Sacred Ashes exists to save Arl Eamon, the player is able to explore the perspective of doubting it to begin with through dialogue choices. When the player eventually meets Colgrim and his cult, they are then confronted with another aspect of faith: the fanatic. Colgrim and his group have been disillusioned by the awe and power of a High Dragon into working directly against the deity that they were created to defend and protect. Their entire life being devoted to their isolated faith leaves them susceptible to being corrupted until they actively work to destroy the very thing that they have worked towards. Then, once the player finds the Urn of Sacred Ashes and takes a pinch from it, they are challenged by Brother Genitivi's devotion to giving the power of the faith to the entire world. The Urn's healing powers are an undeniably powerful tool, but leaving it open and accessible to the entire world runs the risk of it being abused by someone powerful, it being used up too quickly by everyone, or it potentially being used to protect and save terrible people. With all of these choices in play, the quest is able to paint a picture of religion and faith that challenges the player to consider the role of defending something that cannot be proven or disproven, how faith can be used to destroy those it gives strength to, and the role that its potential power should play in wider society. None of it is so explicit that it prevents players who just want to hit shit with a sword from getting through it without feeling preached to, but it is all still there in a way that makes you consider it, even if you don't entirely realize it, and it is available for analysis for any players that are interested in it, like I am. Moving on. With the pinch of ashes in hand, we head back to Redcliffe and resuscitate Arl Eamon. Eamon proves to be eternally grateful and pledges to help defeat Loghain. His plan is to call a Landsmeet, a Ferelden election effectively, to reveal Alistair's heritage and try to place him on the throne. In the meantime, he instructs the player to use the Warden treaties to try and gain more allies in case they are needed. With that, Eamon's support is secured, and we have only 3 main quests left to tackle. At this point, I decided that Morgan's playstyle didn't work for me, so I decided to go to the Circle of Mages to hopefully get another mage option. I also wanted to go, since I meant to go there before I killed that kid, but let's forget about that. To get to the Circle Tower's Kinloch Hold, the player first has to travel to a small shore town on the edge of the lake that the tower is sitting in the middle of. All in all, it is an easy process, and the player heads to Kinloch Hold only to find it placed on lockdown by the Templars, because demons have the tower under their control. The Templar in charge of the situation is our old mage-hating friend, Commander Griagor. He reveals the demons were released by blood mages that are revolting for the right to practice the forbidden art. In response, Griagor plans on enacting the Rite of Annulment, a last resort plan that sees the Templars killing every last mage in Ferelden to prevent the situation getting more out of control. That's obviously not ideal for us because Papa needs a new spell slinger, so we offer to help resolve the situation in a less genocidal manner. Griagor lets us pass into the quarantined tower, but says it will not be lifted until the situation is resolved, so the player is locked in until they finish the quest. On the inside, the player finds a group of surviving mages that have blockaded themselves near the tower's entrance. One of them, named Wynne, asks the player what their plan is, and offers to help if they say that they want to save the mages. If the player tells Wynne that they agree with the call to do the Rite of Annulment, she attacks them, and the player is forced to kill her then and there. I'm not super into mass killings, so Wynne joins my group. I momentarily consider killing the Templars and leaving since I got what I came for, but that also seems a tad close to genocide, so I instead decide to go play Exorcist. The first floor of the tower is a series of demon fights along with a cubic shit ton of codex entries and loot. On the second floor, the player meets Owain, the tranquil that runs the tower's stockroom. If the player didn't start as a mage, Owain delivers some nice exposition before telling them about a mage named Niall that checked out the Litany of Adralla, a chant capable of protecting one from being controlled by a blood mage's spells. From there, the player fights a group of blood mages, with one of them begging for mercy at the end. She tells the player that the senior enchanter Aldred is responsible for the uprising. An outspoken libertarian, Aldred vehemently spoke out against the chantry and quietly recruited susceptible students, teaching them blood magic along the way. With certain backgrounds, specializations, and skills, the player can send her to their camp. Otherwise, they can either let her go or kill her once they are done talking. The rest of the second floor has fights with mages, demons, and skeletons, as well as some side quest stuff. The third floor is then filled with charmed and possessed Templars to fight, which make incredibly quick work of the mages in your parties, so tread carefully. The fourth floor then starts with an interesting encounter with the Desire Demon that has a Templar charmed. The player can kill the demon immediately, but talking to it is much more interesting. She tells the player that she is making the Templar happy by charming him with visions of having a happy family, which he has desperately wanted, but cannot have as a member of the Chantry. The player can thus either let the pair go and live out their familial false life, or can try to kill the demon, which will inevitably kill the Templar in the process. The decision is ultimately inconsequential, but it is a really interesting moral quandary, and I like how it plays with the setting's lore to challenge players a bit. Continuing on the floor, the player comes across a sloth demon that then sends the entire party into the Fade. This begins a lengthy dungeon that I both love and hate. Throughout it, the player unlocks the ability to turn into various forms to navigate a labyrinth of clustered passages that are connected with portals. While doing so, the player rescues their party members, fights countless demons, and eventually lower the sloth demon's defenses and kill it. The great part of this dungeon stems from the atmosphere of the Fade and how much of a puzzle navigating it frequently is. It captures a unique, dreamlike quality excellently, and stands out from everything else in the game, even the mage origin that also sends players to the Fade. The negatives stem from the dungeon's combat. There are a ton of encounters that all feel almost identical. It makes the dungeon drag on so much longer than it should, as you clear dozens of empty rooms with a few identical fights in each one. Every section features a unique cast of enemies, but there is just way too much similar combat here, which is exacerbated by the frequent backtracking through areas while you try to figure out where to go. The dungeon culminates in a fight with the Sloth Demon, otherwise known as one of the hardest fights in the game. It is made up of a whopping 5 phases, with each one being a boss in its own right. It can be brutal without an appropriate composition, but once it is done, the party is spat back out into the real world. In the room where you awaken, you will find the corpse of Niall, with the Litany of Adralla still on him. From there, the player fights their way up to the Harrowing Chamber, where Aldred awaits. Before that, though, the player finds Cullen, a Templar being held in a magical prison. He first believes the party to be demonic apparitions, before saying that Aldred is turning a group of mages into abominations in the Harrowing Chamber. He attempts to convince the party that because of this, the entire circle is tainted, and none of them can be allowed out alive. If you agree, Wynne tries to stop you, forcing you to kill her. The player can also refuse or decide to choose later. From there, it is on to the Harrowing Chamber, where a cutscene shows Aldred turn a mage into an abomination. If If the player still has any questions, they can talk to Uldred to learn more, but no matter what, he must be killed. At the start of combat, it is revealed that he is possessed by a pride demon. The fight takes a while, but has a fun mechanic where you have to use the litany of Adralan mages in the chamber to keep them from being controlled, which is a fun wrinkle to throw into the mix. After killing Uldred, the player will return to Griagor, with either First Chanter Irving or Templar Cullen, depending on whether or not the player opted to kill all of the mages. During the following conversation, the player makes the final decision on which side they want to support. To side with the Templars, the rite of annulment must be carried out. This entire quest is largely to set up and explore the tension and conflict between the two factions. It does a really good job of doing just that, too. It shows how dangerous and powerful the mages can be, goading the player into understanding, if not supporting, the harsh line the Templars and Chantry set for them. It does a good enough job of defining each side that a compelling argument can be made for both. It isn't like deciding to blow up Megaton in Fallout 3, where the only reason to do so is for the loot, or because you just want to be evil for that playthrough. Ideologically, I can't see myself ever siding with the Templars here, but it is easy to imagine people feeling the exact opposite, and they would luckily be justified for feeling that way. I would love to have a conversation with someone that feels that way too, which shows just how well constructed this situation is. It's why so many people love this game. It's fucking awesome. After siding with the mages and permanently recruiting Wynne to our cause, we travel to the Brecilian Forest for the main quest regarding the Dalish Elves. This quest kicks off with the player finding a tribe of roving Dalish led by Keeper Zathrian. Zathrian is surprisingly amicable when it comes to honoring the ancient treaties with the Grey Wardens, but is unable to do so because the tribe has run into severe issues since arriving at this area of the forest. The problem? Werewolves. In particular, a specific werewolf named Witherfane that has spread lycanthropy throughout the tribe. Zathrian's people have been wholly unable to cure the condition once it begins, but thinks Witherfane's heart could lead to a cure. Nobody knows exactly where Witherfane is, though, so we start just wandering around the forest in hopes of finding a clue of some kind. Luckily, the party runs into a small group of werewolves that are up for talking. In particular, one werewolf named Swiftrunner tells the group to turn back before they get hurt. With a high enough coercion, a fight can be avoided here, but most players fight the trio only for them to bolt once they start getting their asses kicked. The player then continues to wander until they find a mysterious fog wall that magically turns them around when going through it. Getting to this fog wall is actually pretty cool. The Brecilian Forest is composed of a few linked areas that all lead to each other in a knot. This helps it feel like a bigger and more naturally confusing area, allowing it to transcend the feel of the game's more segregated spaces that don't usually feel completely interconnected. To get past the fog, the player has to get involved in a disagreement between an ancient Sylvan and a magic hermit. The disagreement centers around an ancient rhyme-speaking Sylvan known as the Grand Oak that is found in the western portion of the forest and is desperate for companionship after long years of loneliness. This led him to developing a very parasocial relationship with his acorns as substitutes. However, a mad hermit living in the forest stole an acorn from him, and he promises to give the player a magical branch that will permit them to navigate the fog barrier if they can retrieve it. Otherwise, the player can also side with the mad hermit. The mad hermit is an apostate blood mage, meaning that he lives outside of the Circle's control, that is hiding from the Templars in the forest. He speaks only in questions and will only speak to others if they do so as well, which can make dealing with him very difficult at first. However, he is very powerful, and offers to enchant a werewolf pelt to allow the player and their party to navigate the fog as long as they kill the Grand Oak for him. The exact reason he wants the Grand Oak dead is not made clear, but his insanity is an easy scapegoat. Whichever side the player decides to help, they are able to make it through the fog wall to reach the area known as the Brecilian Ruins. The ruins are a short dungeon split into 2 levels that are mostly filled with giant spiders and traps made with their webs. The werewolves mock the player when they enter and blockade the entrance to their lair, leaving the player to explore and find another way in. The real crown jewel of the upper floor of the dungeon, however, is a full-size dragon that the player must kill to progress and loot its hoard. After slaying the dragon, the player finds an entrance to the lower level of the ruins, which is mostly filled with undead enemies for them to fight through, followed by some more spiders, other groups of undead, a cubic shit ton of traps, and eventually an arcane horror. Eventually, the player will fight their way through to reach the lair of the werewolves. Once the player gets here, they finally start running into some werewolves and shadow werewolves to fight. Some of these fights can be difficult because of the werewolves' ambush tactics that can make it easy for them to swarm the player and down the entire party before they have time to appropriately react and get themselves into proper positioning. After fighting some werewolves, however, the party is approached by one known as the Gatekeeper, who is sent by their leader, known only as the Lady of the Forest, with an offer to allow them safe entry to parley. The party can refuse to parley and fight the Gatekeeper instead, or they can accept the offer and be escorted to the werewolves' main chamber to talk things through. Through talking with the Lady of the Forest, the player learns about the history between Zetharian and the werewolves. She reveals that Zetharian was the original creator of the werewolves, who were originally human settlers that killed his son and raped his daughter. However, the remaining werewolves are not any of those original criminals, but are instead only humans that wandered into the forest's sense and were cursed. This motivated the werewolves to start attacking the elves as retaliation, and in an attempt to get Zetharian to revert the curse. This also means that Zetharian is the only one who can revert the curse, implicating him in refusing to do so to save his own people until he can weaponize it to kill the humans that he feared threatened his tribe. The final part of the parley is a request for the player to bring Zetharian to her, so that the two parties can talk and try to resolve the issues between them peacefully. At this point, the player has 5 options for how to solve the situation. They can refuse to help bring the two together, causing the lady to turn into Witherfane and attack the player outright. The fight includes the party facing off against Witherfane, Swift Runner, and a handful of other werewolves that are also in the chamber. After the fight, the player leaves the chamber to find Zetharian waiting nearby, who takes Witherfane's heart and apologizes for lying to the player, before saying that he should get back to the camp. The player then follows him back, or heads there themselves, but either way he cures the Dalish back at the camp that are infected with lycanthropy, and rewards the player with a unique axe known as Griffin's Beak. An important note here is that Zetharian also lies to the player afterward, telling them that he is the only one who can use the heart to cure the disease, making it so that players who go this route might never know the full truth, which is really cool. Regardless, the Dalish pledge their support for the Grey Wardens. If the player decides instead to bring Zetharian to talk to the lady, they will find him waiting just outside of the chamber still. He will initially be resistant to the idea, but the player can convince him to at least hear out the Lady of the Forest. At the start of the conversation in the chamber, the lady reveals that when Zetharian created the curse, he used his own blood in the process, tying his mortality to its longevity. However, that does not mean that killing him will end the curse, after which Zetharian ends the talks and attacks the player and werewolves along with the help of some summoned shades and wild sylvans. After the player brings Zetharian down to 0 hit points, he agrees to end the curse, resulting in him and the Lady of the Forest both dying in the process. However, it ends the curse. The player is given Swift Runner's unique shield, and when they return to the Dalish, the new keeper, Linnea, aligns the tribe with the Grey Wardens in thanks for saving their people. When Zetharian ends the talks, the player can also opt to side with Zetharian during the fight, slaying Witherfane, Swift Runner, and a handful or so of other werewolves as well. It ends largely the same way as if the player killed the werewolves from the beginning. One interesting element of killing either side during the meeting, however, is that the player can opt to kill both sides if they want to. In that case, they can take Witherfane's heart to keeper Linnea, who knows how to reverse the curse as well. Doing either of these options results in the player receiving the Dalish's help in fighting the Blight. The final option the player has is to convince Witherfane to kill Zetharian and all of the Dalish elves of the tribe as punishment for what they've done. It requires a lot of points and social skills, but is possible. Going down this route sees the player going back to the Dalish camp with the lady, Swift Runner, and a group of werewolves, after which a massive fight breaks out, because Zetharian refuses to lift the curse no matter what. It results in the player and werewolves killing all of the Dalish in the camp, and the player receives the Magister's Staff, Keeper's Ring, Verathorn's Dara Misu, and Elf Rope. This choice is also the only way to get the Lady of the Forest and werewolves to support the Grey Wardens in the final fight rather than the Dalish elves. In my playthrough, I sided with the werewolves and ended up killing Zetharian alongside them when he attacked the Lady of the Forest during the parley, resulting in the werewolves reverting back to their human forms. The elves being saved by Keeper Linnea, and the Dalish elves pledging themselves according to the old Warden treaties. From there, I followed my last remaining treaty to the subterranean dwarven city of Orzammar. When the player first arrives, they find a messenger from Loghain named Imrek that the dwarves are refusing to allow entry. The player can choose to either scare Imrek away or fight him, but either option makes little difference, and results in the player gaining entry into the city. From there, the player has the option to explore and learn some more about Dwarven culture, how their caste system is structured, and start picking up inklings of its current political turmoil that is at the center of the area's main quest. The player first gets involved with it when they meet either Lord Harrowmont or Prince Balin Dukin. The two are vying for control of the Dwarven throne after the death of their king. Both of the candidates send the player on lengthy quests to prove the legitimacy of their claim and convince the people of Orzammar to side with them. The player can also speak with citizens throughout the town to learn more about them, and they can switch between supporting each candidate at any time during the quest lines. Each candidate has different strengths and weaknesses, but Balin does also come with leverage of restoring the warden's status as a member of House Adukin in exchange for their support if they chose the dwarf noble origin. Either way, Balin is a radical candidate that supports some rights for casteless dwarves and operates with a belief that his goals are worth doing whatever it takes to achieve them. He is contrasted by Lord Harrowmont, who was one of the previous king's greatest advisors. He prefers to stand by the more traditional ways of the dwarves, including extreme isolationism and following their strict traditions and honor-bound behaviors. When the warden first arrives in Orzammar, they are unable to meet with either candidate and have to complete a task for either one to actually meet them. If the player wants to side with Prince Balin, they meet his representative Vartag, who asks them to help expose a real estate scam being used by Lord Harrowmont to get illegal votes. If the player instead wants to side with Lord Harrowmont, they meet with Dulin, who tasks the player with helping figure out what is going on with some of his champions in the Proving, a gladiatorial combat meant to help decide which dwarf deserves the throne. The player ends up persuading two champions to stay in the Proving, and then joins it themselves if they decide to go down this route. Regardless of which initial candidate the player decides to support, they end up being asked to help deal with the organized criminal Jarvia that runs a fierce gang known as the Carta in the Dusttown region of Orzammar where the casteless live. There are a few different ways to go about this by speaking with dwarves throughout Dusttown, to piece together the Carta's operations and find a way to infiltrate it themselves. Eventually, the player will find a way into one of the Carta's warehouses, where they have to face off against Jarvia and their friend Lesk if they want through the Dwarven Commoner origin. After the player kills Jarvia and all of his compatriots in the warehouse, they are ready to move on to the third task. The third task sees the candidate charging the player with venturing into the Deep Roads to find a paragon named Branka that went into them in search of the Anvil of the Void and hadn't returned after a number of years, so that she can come back and voice her support for the player's chosen candidate. The Anvil of the Void is an ancient relic that allowed the dwarves to make golems that had been lost long ago, preventing them from making any more ever since. The player then fights their way through numerous areas within the Deep Roads, along with fighting a couple special Darkspawn, known as the Ancient Darkspawn and the Genlock Forge Master. Both of them are tough fights if the player isn't prepared, which does great to keep the Deep Roads feeling as terrifying for the player as they are said to be in the setting. Eventually, the player makes their way to Caridin's Cross, where they will be attacked by mercenaries for the opposite candidate, unless the player is supporting both and secretly planning on betraying one of them. Along with them, there are numerous Darkspawn and some demons, reaching the abandoned dwarven city Ortenthag after dealing with them. In Ortenthag, the player finds evidence of Paragon Branka having been there, kills some spiders that ambush them, and then exits to an area known as the Dead Trenches. Reaching the Dead Trenches comes with the massive moment of seeing the Archdemon for the first time in person, and it is a frightening presence to be sure. After continuing on, the player comes across some dwarves fighting Darkspawn, and after helping them, the player can talk to one of them named Cardle. Cardle explains to the player that he belongs to the Legion of the Dead, a group of highly trained dwarven warriors that are exiled from Orzammar into the Deep Roads, where they fight Darkspawn until they eventually die. They help the player out for a bit before separating ways, and after exploring some more, the player finds their way to the Anvil of the Void, where they also run into Paragon Branka. However, in a nice twist, the player meets Branka by trapping them and their party in the cave with her. She is completely unable to be reasoned with, and in time it becomes crystal clear that she has been driven near insanity by her quest to reach the Anvil. She has sacrificed all of her men in trying to make it past the traps that protect it. And the player just so happens to have brought a new set of bodies for her to throw at her goal. The 4 traps aren't all literal traps that need to be disarmed, but are more akin to challenges, such as slaying a hallway filled to the brim with Darkspawn. After dealing with that, the player fights golems in a room steadily filling with poisonous gas. The third is fighting golems in a hall with spinning blade traps, and the fourth is fighting a massive construct known as the Spirit Apparatus. After making their way through the trap, the player reaches the Anvil of the Void and is approached by another paragon, this one by the name of Caridin and in the body of a golem. Caridin reveals that he was the original inventor of the golems, and that he was responsible for creating all of them. While the remaining dwarves are extremely proud of Paragon Caridin, and sing his and his work's praises constantly, the entire ordeal has filled him with an enormous amount of guilt, because he could only create golems by dwarves giving their lives over to the process. When Caridin first started, he accepted volunteers, warriors mostly, that were more than willing to give their lives over to be immortal servants of the dwarven realm. However, that did not last long, as eventually he started taking prisoners that were subjected to the torturous process against their wills, only to then be controlled with control rods to do the bidding of others. Eventually, Caridin was forced to subject himself to the process, becoming a golem and staying by the anvil to prevent it from ever being used again. At that moment, Paragon Caridin requests that the player do what he cannot, and destroy the anvil to prevent it from subjecting anyone else to being a golem. Shortly after he requests this of the player, Paragon Branka arrives to try and persuade the player into instead using the Anvil of the Void to build a new army of golems, to serve them and the Grey Wardens in fending off the Blight. At that point, the player can decide to support either Paragon and their respective option, or the player can convince Branka to destroy the Anvil and support her, but you can only do so after helping her kill Caridin for some reason. I guess BioWare just really isn't comfortable with the idea of not having a boss fight at the climax of the quest. If the player destroys the Anvil, whichever Paragon they supported ultimately ends up committing suicide at the end of the quest, leaving only dwarves to support the player in the final battle. If the player supports Paragon Branka, however, and keeps the Anvil, she will stay there to run it, and the player will ultimately be supported by both dwarves and golems when the time comes. Whichever Paragon the player supports also ends up making the player a crown with their insignia on it, to show that they have gained the Paragon's favor. This allows the player to return to Orzammar and use this to give their approval and the approval of the Paragon to whichever candidate for regency they end up wanting to support. Regardless of which option the player chooses, the opponent will end up being killed. In the case of Balin, he will choose to execute Harrowmont and cannot be persuaded otherwise, while choosing Harrowmont causes Balin to attack him in a fury, forcing the player's hand into killing him. The player will also receive a different item from each option, depending on how well they supported them throughout the questline, which is a fun detail but doesn't really have any impact on the larger game. Finally, as the player is leaving after the election, they run into Cardle, the leader of the Legion of the Dead again. At that point, Dwarven warriors can ask Cardle for help in dealing with the Blight, and they will gladly offer it. If the Warden is either a human or elf, however, Cardle will need to be persuaded through a very difficult skill check. If he can be persuaded to join you, though, the Legion of the Dead will be seen fighting alongside other dwarves during the final battle, while Cardle actually helps the player out in fighting the Archdemon, which is a fun addition. With all of the old treaties called upon and respected, the player returns to Denerim to prepare for the lance meet arranged by Arl Eamon. The player gets set up in the Arl's estate within the city, and shortly after arriving they are asked to meet with a royal handmaid named Erlina. Erlina tells a heart-wrenching story of King Kaelin's widow being held captive and manipulated by Logan, who is her own father, for him to hold control over the city. She begs the player to help free her from the Arl of Denerim's estate, where she is being held captive. Even if the player expresses suspicion over Erlina's testimony and good timing, they are ultimately convinced to try and save the queen because of how good the optics would be for the lance meet. So, the player assembles a party that are all able to blend in with Arl Howe's personal guard to gain access to the building, and they mount a rescue operation. Because of an uprising in the alienage, the Arl's estate is surrounded by protesting peasants when the player arrives, forcing them to enter through the back entrance. Doing so isn't that big of a trial, and transitions the player into the estate as a dungeon, which has the interesting element of allowing the player to try and maintain their cover while going through it. Doing so isn't very difficult, but ultimately doesn't have much of an impact on the final results either. Eventually, the player makes their way to the estate's dungeons in the basement, where they expect to come across the queen, but also find another Grey Ward being kept prisoner there by the name of Riordan. Riordan was one of the other inductees present at Alistair's joining ceremony, and can be released to help the player later on. From this point, the player can no longer maintain their disguise, and have to start fighting anyone they come across. After fighting through the remains of the dungeon, the player comes across Arl Howe himself, who taunts the player a bit before jumping into a combat encounter. This moment ends up feeling pretty disappointing. The player has a few encounters with Arl Howe leading up to this point, especially if they take the human noble origin, and the dialogue options don't manage to pay off that relationship or give the player a satisfying moment right before the fight. The dialogue also feels oddly linear for the game when compared to most of the other big moments during quests that give options for different results or at least how to react to events. I'm sure that it's just because the game story needs the final events of the quest to transition the player into the final acts of the main story, but the moment does end up falling a bit flat comparatively because of how restrictive it is. After killing Arl Howe, the player is able to take his eye and open a corridor that leads to the Queen's chambers so that they can get to Queen Honora and start leading her out of the estate. While doing so, the player comes across Logain's devoted knight, Sir Cawthrion, at the exit, who threatens to kill the player if they don't surrender themselves. The player can try to talk their way out of it by telling him that Queen Honora wants to leave with them, but Honora will instead sell the player out, lying to say that she is being kidnapped only to run away. At this point, the player has two options to deal with Sir Cawthrion. They can either fight back or surrender. If the player fights back and kills Sir Cawthrion, they are free to go afterward and get the unique Summer Sword, but it is one of the most difficult fights in the game. If the player loses during the fight or surrenders, they, and Alistair if he is in the party, are captured for being rogue Grey Wardens and are sent to Fort Drekken to await execution. Once the player is captured, they can either try to escape themselves or put their trust in their capable party members and wait for them to come and break them out. Breaking out yourself is the most straightforward option, so I want to cover that one first. First, you have to get out of the cell, which can be done either by seducing the guard, lying about sensing Darkspawn nearby, picking the lock, or pretending to be sick. After the player gets out of the cage, they have to fight past a guard and some dogs to find an equipment room, where they can loot a guard's uniform to pass inspection from an officer and escape. The moment is a solid idea, but it doesn't pay off very well. There's some obtuse execution that makes it clunky to make one's way through it, because its implementation is a bit cryptic. Once you make it through, however, you're free. If the player decides instead to wait for their allies to come rescue them, they can select two party members that they have a high enough relationship with to come. During the rescue, the player takes control of those two party members to bluff their way into the fort and reach the player's character. This whole section is just great, really. It offers a really fun way for players to interact with their party members in an unusual way that they normally wouldn't be able to. And there's a lot of solid humor in the scenes. Each party member has their own strengths and approach towards getting past each of the 3 checkpoints that they have to lie their way through. This does mean that there are optimal groups to bring into the section, but if you're a new player, I think it is a lot better to just follow your gut. Stripping it down to the mechanics beneath it spoils a lot of the fun and magic at play just under the surface of the scene. Regardless of the route the player opts to take, once they escape Fort Drekken, they return to the estate of Arl Eamon. If the player defeated Sir Cawthrion, they return with Queen Honora in tow, but if Honora sold them out, she will already be there. If the player confronts her, she scolds them for trying to bring her into the fight, and explains that she only did what she had to do to try and get away. The player might not want to go along with Queen Honora if they feel spurned by the whole being betrayed and left for dead thing, but they have to go along with it and work with her regardless. The first part of Queen Honora's plan to stop Logain is to investigate recent disturbances in the alienage, to try and find evidence that can be used to discredit him during the Landsmeet. When the player first reaches the alienage, they discover that the elves stuck living in the slums are beset upon by a terrible sickness that seems to be connected to the blight somehow. After looking around for a while, the player discovers that elves that catch the disease are shockingly being treated, with the biggest air quotes you've ever seen, by doctors from the Tevinter Imperium. However, the player also meets an elf named Shiani that claims the lead Tevinter healers, Varys and Serator, aren't actually healing the elves at all. Her suspicions stem from multiple notable elves going missing after being given over to the Tevinters. She has been questioning why none of the seen elves are ever seen again, and she asks the player to look into what is actually going on. To get into the hospice, the player has a few options, like fighting their way in, bribing guards, or pretending to be sick until they are let in. Once inside of the hospice, the player has to kill their way through all of the Tevinters, finding some disparate clues of what is actually going on throughout the process. Once the hospice is thoroughly searched, Shiani will say the Tevinter must be using another building in the alienage to finish whatever it is they're doing, which leads the player to the rundown apartments that have also been restricted since they showed up. At the apartments, the player finds a bunch more people along with evidence that the Tevinters are taking all of the sick elves and shipping them back to the Imperium, where they are being sold into slavery. This leads them to the warehouse where they are being shipped from, where the player confronts the leader of the operation, a Tevinter wizard named Caladrius. Now, the player can refuse to talk to Caladrius and attack him outright if they wish, or they can talk with him for a while and see what he has to say about the whole thing. He quickly makes it apparent that he does not feel at all remorseful for what he is doing, and actually has a chilling, calculating reason for it all. Instead, he offers the player a deal. Pay him 100 gold dragons and let him go free with his slaves, and he'll give the player physical proof of Logain's involvement with the entire scheme. The player can accept the deal outright, or they can use a persuasion check to not pay him the money, or intimidate him to offer it in various ways, to get the letter without paying one portion of their side of the deal, or pay none of it and just let Caladrius leave with his life. If the player rejects the deal completely and fights him, Caladrius tries to pay for his life by offering to perform a blood ritual to empower the player moving forward once he is defeated. The player doesn't know exactly what the ritual will do for them before choosing it, but it raises their constitution by 1, although it does require him to siphon the life from every slave elf in the area to power it. I wasn't hearing any of that, so I just ended up killing him like the slime he is, but even if the player chooses that route, they still are able to loot the letter that damns Logain from his corpse. With the evidence required to condemn Logain in hand, the player is ready to attend the Landsmeet to try to take Logain down, and unite Ferelden against the coming Blight. The Landsmeet is effectively a long cutscene, interrupted with dialogue decisions that allow the player to try and persuade the various rulers of Ferelden to take the player's side over Logain's. Winning the Landsmeet requires the player to accumulate 5 influence points through having completed side quests to help rulers beforehand, making correct arguments against Logain, having Anora's support, and not losing too many points from losing arguments. The whole system works really well, and helps underline the great and detailed geopolitical details baked into Dragon Age's setting. Breaking down every option and moment of the Landsmeet isn't really necessary here, and would take far too long, since so many different moments and decisions all play into it to various degrees. What matters is that in the end, the player either wins or loses. If the player loses the Landsmeet, Arl Eamon refuses to go down without a fight, and sparks a brawl in which the player is able to overthrow Logain and his supporters. If the player wins the Landsmeet, Logain pulls an identical move, so either way the Landsmeet ends up in a similar situation, with a duel between Logain and either the player or one of the party members elected as their champion. The player can attempt to refuse the duel completely, but this just makes Alistair accept the duel as the illegitimate son of King Cailan. Once the duel is won, it is time to decide Logain's fate. If Alistair was the one in the duel, he immediately kills Logain without a second of hesitation. If the player fought in the duel, Riordan will appear from nowhere, pitching the idea of punishing Logain by forcing him to join the Grey Wardens and help the player stop the Blight. However, this option will see Alistair becoming outraged and leaving the party permanently. If the player doesn't want to let Logain live, they have the option of performing the execution themselves like a good Stark, or having Alistair do it to let out some of his anger issues. With Logain deposed, there are then also choices to be made regarding who will lead Ferelden moving forward. The 2 options are Alistair or Queen Anora. In the case of electing Alistair, he can either rule alone, can be married to Anora, or if the player is a female human noble, the player can even opt to marry Alistair and rule as his queen. If the player doesn't want him to rule, he can either stay a Grey Warden and face the Blight beside the player, or he can end up being executed by the elected Queen Anora because she doesn't want him to potentially threaten her rule in the future. On the flip side of that decision, if the player elects Alistair, he will want to imprison Anora to avoid her threatening his rule, but after crying and throwing a fit about it for a bit first. I don't like whiny man-children ruling my kingdoms, so I opted to elect Queen Anora, after recruiting Logain for a sweet Xbox achievement. So Alistair ended up pouting and running off to Maker knows where. All in all, I think this section of Origins is both effective and disappointing. It is a pivotal scene in the game main questline, and after talking with friends of mine that have played Origins before, it seems to be highly memorable. However, going back to it now, it does end up feeling a bit forced in some ways. It is disappointing just how much it forces players into certain situations and decisions, although I really like how heavy the consequences are for the players' decisions within it. There's no real perfect scenario for players to try and get, which feels very appropriate for the game's more serious and mature setting that is filled with consequences and tough decisions. So I think it works well, especially for a game from its time period, but now it does also make me daydream a bit about a modern entry in the series being able to do with a similar scenario and more resources. The next portion of the main quest is its penultimate scene, beginning after the Ferelden forces congregate at Redcliffe Castle. The night before the battle, it is revealed to the player, either through Riordan or Alistair, depending on who is still around, that the only way to kill the Archdemon for good is for a Grey Warden to give their life in the process by striking the final blow against the beast. This allows the Archdemon's life force to go directly into the Warden, killing them both. This plot point is never completely explained, and honestly feels really contrived. You can obviously assume that it has something to do with the taint being present in all Grey Wardens, but how does that actually matter? The taint is not something caused by the Archdemon, it creates the Archdemon. As a reminder, the Archdemon is an old god that has been corrupted and resurrected by the taint that is at the center of the Darkspawn, driving them to start blights to try and spread the taint to the surface world. Since old gods are just extremely powerful demons from the Fade that were worshipped by humans until they grew in power to reach the power levels of deities. So how does that power being infused with the taint make it die once it enters the body of a mortal also corrupted by the taint? The game's lack of interest in explaining it doesn't help it feel any more sensical either. It all ends up feeling exactly like what it is, a ploy to add another big decision to influence the ending of the game. Moving on though. After learning this troubling element of ending the blight, the player is approached by Morrigan if she is still with the player. She reveals a plan she has to save the Warden's life by having her get pregnant with a Grey Warden's baby. Her thought is that then if she is the one to deal the final blow to the Archdemon, its essence would instead go directly into the baby. For some reason, she also believes that it won't kill the baby, but will actually allow the old god's soul to live on in the child, bringing an old god into the world that is free of the Darkspawn's taint. Let's just ignore the fact that this also doesn't make any goddamn sense, and instead focus on how massive of an ask that is of the player. As a kid, I accepted the deal, just because I had spent the entire game trying to bane Morrigan, and there was no way I was going to let a small thing like releasing a being of unimaginable power and consequences free into the world under the tutelage of a power-hungry, rage-fueled, and retributive apostate get in the way of that. Morrigan also refuses to tell the player what she plans on doing with the child, but she does tell them that this was the entire reason Flemeth saved the Wardens and sent Morrigan with them at all. Now that I'm older and I'd like to think wiser, I recognize just how insane of an idea this really is, so I refused and resigned myself instead to the fate of sacrificing my life in order to end the blight and save all of Thedas, just like all of the Papa Grey Wardens intended. With that decision sorted, we head to Denerim the next day to face the blight once and for all. The battle in Denerim is split up into multiple sections, as the player and their party make their way through different movements of the fight. The first is just around the city gates. One particularly fun aspect of this section of the battle is that all of the party members available to the player fight together for the only time in the game, giving it a really climactic feeling as the player carves through Darkspawn surrounded by their allies and devoted friends. It gives the scene an extra sense of scale on top of the cinematic backgrounds and skyboxes. Once the gates are secured, the player has to build a party to journey further into the city, and eventually face the Archdemon with them. They are also told that if they want, they can try to kill 2 Darkspawn generals that are in the market in Alienage, although they are falsely told that it is possible to not kill either one at all. In reality, the player has to kill at least one, with the second being an option. Not that it makes too much of a difference. It's just a weird discrepancy that is rare in this game. The remainder of the party is left behind to help defend the gates, with the player occasionally returning to play as them during fights, which is a great feature to, again, help give the scene more scale, and feel like a sprawling fight spread throughout the city, and not just around the player in one location within it. The player also has to pick which of their party members will act as the leader of those left to defend the gate, with the help of the allies the player gathered with their treaties. After killing either one or both of the Darkspawn generals, the player can travel to the Palace District. When they first travel there, they are sent back to play as the party guarding the gates in a trivially easy fight. At the Palace District, the player fights their way toward Fort Draken, where the plan is to lure the Archdemon so that the player can face it and kill it once and for all. The Fort Draken section is split into a couple different areas, but all of it can be summarized as just killing groups of Darkspawn and moving on, so there isn't too much for me to go over here. One interesting layer to it, though, is that the player has the option of summoning the groups that have allied with them through these sections of fighting. Most of the fights aren't difficult enough to really necessitate doing so, but it is still a fun addition that helps the player feel like somewhat of a commander, without having to add an entire new suite of mechanics to make them actually control or guide the battle in a larger way. Eventually, the player fights their way through all of Fort Draken, but there is one moment here that I want to highlight, although it takes some setting up. So, one part of Origins that we haven't talked about yet is the party camp, an area the player can always travel to and talk to their party members, change who is traveling with them, sell and buy supplies, and talk with 2 dwarves that are able to enchant the player's equipment. The 2 dwarves are Sandal and Bodan. Bodan is a merchant that adopted Sandal, a savant when it comes to dwarven ruins used for enchanting. Throughout the game, Sandal only ever says,
Enchantment? Enchantment!
and is never really shown to have interest in anything else. So just before the player reaches the rooftop of Fort Draken, where they will face the Archdemon, the player comes across Sandal standing in a room coated in blood and surrounded by dozens of Darkspawn corpses. This gives the player the opportunity to upgrade any of the new gear they receive during the final section of the game, but also is just a really funny moment to punctuate through the drama of the game's climax. On Fort Draken's roof, the player is faced with the Archdemon Dragon for the final confrontation. The fight is appropriately challenging and epic for the final boss of the game. It's split into 3 phases, with the Archdemon summoning smaller Darkspawn to help throughout. One weird element of this fight, though, is that the player can be assisted by the leaders of the groups that allied with them, but only if they are playing on PC. There are a lot of weird little differences between playing on PC and console, like fights playing out differently, players getting different loot, etc., but not having people to help fight the Archdemon is definitely the most significant. Once the Archdemon has been slain, the player has to make one final decision: who deals the final blow? If the player accepts Morrigan's offer, this choice is made for them, and they kill the Archdemon to have its essence go into the new baby. Otherwise, if the player has another Grey Warden with them, namely Alistair or Loghain, they have to decide which one of them gives their life for the cause. The player has full control over the situation unless Alistair is in love with them, which causes him to always sacrifice his life for theirs no matter what, which is a nice touch. Once the Archdemon is slain, the player returns to the Landsmeet Hall a short time later, where they have the opportunity to talk to their party members one final time and wrap up all of the game's side narratives. After the game is officially over, the player is treated to one of those classic RPG ending slideshows, where narration and still visuals show the consequences of all the player's actions and choices throughout the game. I've personally never minded these endings, especially with smaller games or new IPs like Origins that don't have the budget to accommodate all of the possible outcomes that they want to give players agency and thoroughly explore their stories and worlds. There are some weird bugs that can happen with the final slideshow in Origins, but overall I think it works pretty well to wrap things up. The story as a whole is really great, and I think is why Origins has managed to be as iconic and popular as it has. I'll cover some more story elements when we get to the companions, so I'll save my final thoughts on it until we've covered the game's narrative content in its entirety, but suffice it to say for now that the main quest does a great job of introducing players to the world of Thedas, of telling a solid story that plays around with the standard pieces of fantasy worlds to make something new, and taking full advantage of its nature as an interactive piece of art to explore its world, characters, and stories in a way that you can't in any other medium. Now that we've gone through the story, let's take a look at combat. Players kill countless enemies throughout the game's runtime, and a solid portion of the game is spent in combat encounters. This makes it all the more unfortunate that going back now in 2023, I honestly think the combat is all in all the weakest part of Origins. As I said in the introduction, Mass Effect and Dragon Age Origins were both part of an effort by BioWare to reinvent their approach to RPGs to work on consoles as well as PCs, after the release of The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind showed just how successful the genre could be there. However, this was many years before more classic-style CRPGs like Divinity Original Sin, Baldur's Gate 3, and ports of classic games like Planescape Torment and Neverwinter Nights found ways to adapt the CRPG formula and control style to controllers smoothly. So, the studio continued exploring the combat mechanics they had started using in games like Knights of the Old Republic. The system looks like this. Characters automatically attack targets at a set interval, similar to how basic attack works in a traditional MMO like World of Warcraft, or even RuneScape. While characters are performing attacks, players can activate abilities that they have assigned to 6 quick slots, or they can access a radial menu to get to all of their characters' unlocked abilities. Once an ability is activated, it is used instead of the next attack, against whatever enemy the character is targeting. Some abilities have an area of effect, which pauses the action and requires the player to set where they want it to be used before the action is unpaused and continues. During combat, players are also able to pause time manually whenever they want, allowing them to switch between members of their party, set up abilities, analyze the situation to think of what to do, and use consumables. Players can move their characters around combat arenas freely at any time, although it does lead to some issues of characters being hit when they are clearly multiple feet away from where they would have been to be hit by a sword swing or some other melee attack. Another foil is added to combat through spell combinations that allow players to mix set spells together for greater effect, such as creating a grease fire or summoning a more powerful undead minion after first empowering your character with spell might. A lot of the normal elements of RPG combat all come into play here. Certain characters deal bonus damage when attacking from behind, characters have armor values and resistances that play into calculating damage, characters have resource pools like fatigue and mana that have to be managed, etc., etc. The system is a solid attempt at translating the more complicated elements of the CRPG subgenre with the ease of access and slimmed down controls required to run on a controller. But it does run into some significant issues. One of the chief issues comes from targeting, which is especially frustrating on higher difficulties where the player needs things to work how and when they intend them to. With not having a mouse cursor to actually select the enemy you want to target, it is an all too common occurrence to try and target an enemy with an ability to only have it instead target one next to them or a different one entirely. This is particularly frustrating when playing a character that uses ranged spells or weapons. Using abilities with areas of effect from far away works just fine, but when you are trying to just target a single enemy with a direct attack, it can be really frustratingly difficult to target the enemy you are actually intending to hit. The clunkiness of using abilities in general is actually the source for most of the game's woes when it comes to combat. To make the most out of each character's full kit, players have to repeatedly switch between them, pause combat, and use the ability that they want that character to use, which grinds the pacing down to an absolute crawl. Players do have the ability to set up simple if-then statements to program their party members and how they act when they're on their own, but the system doesn't work very well, despite being a solid early effort. To start, characters have to invest skill points to use it more fully, which means that the price for not having to annoyingly micromanage party members in the system is objectively weakening their build. It also is very clunky to use with tons of drop-down menus to navigate, laggy menu performance, and not enough options to actually do everything that you might want to have automated for your party members. It works fine for very simple conditionals, but only allows you to set slightly reactive commands. To really be useful, players would have to be given a lot more choices when it comes to having party members using abilities in reaction to other characters using an ability, targeting enemies depending on more detailed information, things like that. With how poorly the system ultimately works, I don't recommend wasting your time on it at all. Constantly switching between characters to use abilities throughout every fight can get very annoying, especially on the highest difficulties, but it is much better than spending far too long trying to find a way to get a party member to use a spell when you want them to, only for it to not work anyways, no matter how many times you go back and adjust the setting. A similar instance of a solid idea being hindered by poor execution comes in the form of Origin's combo spell mechanic. Ideally, a mechanic like this would encourage players to experiment with their magical options, to find new powerful combinations, and react to the challenges of each encounter with a branching tree of possible ones. This is what can be found in titles from around the same time, like The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind or Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. Instead of hitting this admittedly lofty ideal, the system ends up being unfortunately restrictive. There are so few combinations that there is hardly any experimenting to be done, and they are each powerful enough that playing a magic-focused character easily becomes an exercise in repeating those standard combinations, like clockwork, during every fight. This does help ensure that players don't have to constantly pause the flow of combat to properly optimize their spell interactions at every opportunity, but also relegates the entire mechanic to feeling like an afterthought. On harder difficulties, the problems with combat in Origins are greatly exacerbated as well. Higher difficulty settings in video games are a difficult balancing act. The best implementation of higher difficulty comes in games where playing on the hardest difficulty forces the player to engage with its mechanics and systems at greater length and depth. Games like Resident Evil 2, Doom Eternal, or Divinity Original Sin 2 all require players to have a masterful understanding of every facet of them to make it through on these challenging experiences. This is not true for Dragon Age Origins. Instead, playing on the highest difficulty in Origins stretches out every fight by severely bloating the hit point pools of enemies and their resistances, while increasing their damage. It requires players to tolerate long combat encounters of slowly chipping away at life bars, while narrowly avoiding being killed with a single hit. This is not bad in principle, but with how clunky combat controls in Origins are, it becomes more frustrating than anything else. One issue in particular comes from how difficult it is to quickly move one's party members out of areas of danger that are being telegraphed. This is annoying on any difficulty, but on the highest, it frequently leads to full party wipes that are altogether unacceptable. The trial of playing through Origins on this difficulty is obviously possible, but there is a good reason why the game's wiki is filled with exploits and tricks to skip content or cheese your way through encounters. All of this is to say that combat in Dragon Age Origins is largely just adequate. Most of it boils down to little more than sitting around watching characters wallop enemies. It does enough to not detract from enjoying the game's story and characters, especially on subsequent playthroughs, but it doesn't do enough to make playing it for the combat worthwhile. Instead, players are more likely to find an approach that works and stick to it, only going up to the highest difficulty if they have a second screen ready with exploits to make it tolerable. A key component of combat and defining one's character in Dragon Age Origins comes in the form of classes, a staple feature of RPGs. As a series, Dragon Age sticks to the standard trio of warriors, mages, and rogues. However, each class is given further variation with specializations that give players access to more abilities and traits to construct builds around. Before looking at how the game handles classes and builds, though, we need to understand how characters in Origins are defined. Each one is split into their attributes, skills, and either spells for mages or talents for warriors and rogues. Attributes form the foundation of every character by putting a numerical value to their abilities and characteristics. Each character is defined by 6 attributes: Constitution, Cunning, Dexterity, Magic, Strength, and Willpower. Constitution is the measure of a character's physical continence, granting additional health and resistance to physical damage for invested points. Cunning measures a character's mental speed, allowing them to penetrate armor effectively, resist mental damage, and influences a lot of what rogues get up to. Dexterity, meanwhile, relates to the character's physical speed and control, giving them more physical attack and defense. Magic is obviously related to the character's magical abilities, and is thus only useful for mage characters. Strength is self-explanatory and puts a numerical value to how strong the character is, allowing them to carry more equipment and hit harder with melee weapons. Finally, willpower represents the character's grit and determination, increasing their mana or stamina that is used to perform spells or talents, as well as also raising their resistance to mental attacks and effects. Skills are then directly impacted by attributes, and are universal abilities that characters are able to use outside of combat. They are responsible for defining the routes players take quests, what optional content they interact with, and how useful their party is outside of killing things quickly. As players level up, their party members all receive skill points, to invest in a total of 8 skills with 4 levels each. Rogues receive slightly more skill points to help round them out as a utility class that supports the party's exploration and supplies. The first skill we'll talk about is Coercion. Coercion is a social skill that allows the player to attempt skill checks and conversations to try and intimidate or persuade NPCs. These checks provide alternate paths through quest lines, while also giving players the opportunity to get more rewards or skip combat encounters entirely. While they aren't nearly as fleshed out or influential as many other RPGs, they do provide an alright level of variety, while also helping players further define their wardens by how they interact with others. The second is Combat Tactics, which I've already touched on a bit in the combat section earlier in this video. Leveling it up unlocks additional if-then statement slots for players to dictate a character's actions in combat while not playing them. This makes the skill relatively necessary for characters the player doesn't wish to play too frequently. Confusingly, however, each level of the skill also has the prerequisite of certain cunning levels, which can require the player to invest in cunning for characters they don't want to play, even if they have no other use for the investment. Combat training is a skill used to gate off talents related to weapon types like dual wielding, one-handed, and shield, two-handed, etc. This ends up feeling like a bit of a waste in practice. While levels in combat training do have benefits for mages, they are negligible enough to be skipped over almost always. This results in the martial classes ending up having fewer options that are less flashy or exciting as mages, while also needing to invest skill points to access a portion of them, whereas mages do not. Herbalism as a skill helps the player save money and better prepare for the challenges of the game by crafting their own beneficial alchemical concoctions like potions and poultices. To craft them, the player has to collect numerous ingredients, either from around their environment or through purchasing them from merchants. There aren't enough resources spread throughout the game to allow the herbalism skill to entirely replace having to purchase at least some of these items, but it does help mitigate the financial cost of keeping your party on their feet and breathing. Poison making is the aggressive flip side to herbalism, allowing the player to make poisons and grenades to help them better tear apart their enemies. It also shares an identical gameplay loop with herbalism, requiring the player to collect ingredients either from nature or merchants to craft individual uses of possible recipes for them to eventually use during combat. However, characters also need to have at least one level of the skill purchased before they are even able to use the products of poison making, resulting in it being a more narrow skill used to augment the performance of a single character rather than helping the entire party. Stealing is a skill that is focused entirely on pickpocketing, begging the question of why it isn't named accordingly. Regardless, investing points in the skill allows the player to pilfer larger and more valuable objects from the unsuspecting, while also decreasing the chance that the player is discovered, receiving negative impressions and possibly even random encounters. There are particular NPCs that have been flagged as particularly worthwhile of a quick pocket by the community on the series fandom, but beyond that list, there is very little use for stealing as a whole, beyond the player doing so for a quick dopamine injection or to satisfy role-playing motivations. The survival skill is one of the most useful and universal in the game. It allows the player to track enemy locations on their minimap, which can help a surprising amount while exploring. Even better is that only one party member needs the skill for it to be active regardless of which character the player is actively controlling, making it a skill that is well worth investing in for every playthrough. The final skill is trap making, and I bet you can't guess what it's for. Mechanically, trap making works similarly to herbalism and poison making. However, it also requires the player to have plans for each creation to follow when crafting them. The skill also increases the character's effectiveness at detecting traps laid by enemies, although only rogue characters can actually take advantage of that information to disarm the traps. Talents and spells both fulfill the role of being the abilities characters have available to them while in the throes of combat. The options that characters have to pick from depend on which of the 3 classes they belong to, as well as that class's specializations. So we'll need to take a close look at each of the classes to accurately understand what these are. Let's look at the warrior class first, for no particular reason. The warrior class is largely the foundation of the game's combat system. They can use melee or ranged weapons, can fulfill either tank or damage roles, and have large reserves of stamina to allow them to frequently take advantage of their talents. They are also the only of the 3 classes that have access to talents for all 4 weapon types: archery, dual weapon, two-handed, and weapon and shield. Each of these selections of talents give the player combat options as long as they have those weapons currently equipped. Apart from specializations, which are effectively subclasses, each class also has 3 of their own talent lines to upgrade, as well as 3 more talent lines through whichever type of weapon they prefer to wield. This system occasionally takes some of the excitement out of leveling up because of how linear leveling generally is, but it does give players the ability to at least slightly customize their character builds without going too wayward or unfocused with an overabundance of options. Since the 4 weapon talent trees are generally universal, however, let's go over them now, since warriors have access to them all. Each one holds 3 linear subtrees that contain 4 skills that have to be unlocked in the set order. This helps ensure that the character's abilities level up with them, while helping guide players toward effective builds by preventing them from investing points too sporadically across a more web-like skill tree. The archery weapon talent has 1 tree to allow them to perform better when enemies encroach on you during combat. Another tree contains crowd control options that allow characters to stop target movement for a time, while also finishing targets off through high damage critical hits. Its final tree focuses instead on the character's damage output by increasing their fire rate, picking apart a target's armor, and hitting groups of enemies all at once. These trees focus archer characters on controlling enemies through hindered movement and debuffs, and dealing highly specific damage at the right moment to capitalize on the strong play of the rest of the party. The dual weapon talents are a bit different, because without point investment in it, the character receives penalties on attacks with the weapon in their offhand. To counteract this, the player has to invest points in its first talent tree that decreases that penalty and makes the character more efficient in using dual weapon talents. The second tree focuses on increasing the damage dealt by the character with quick bursts by utilizing both weapons. This can be through just hitting with both at once, or quickly following up an attack with a follow-up and getting guaranteed critical hits. The final talent line focuses on increasing the character's attack speed through talents that quickly lash out with multiple attacks that deal normal damage in a stance that increases the character's attack speed at the cost of stamina. Overall, characters using the dual weapon talents are focused purely on dealing damage. They have a spare talent or 2 that applies debuffs, but it places a heavy focus on dealing out damage at pivotal moments when enemies are at their most vulnerable. Two-handed talents closely reflect the nature of two-handed weapons themselves, slow attacks that deal a ton of damage. Its first talent line focuses on stunning enemies and leaving them vulnerable to high damage follow-ups, whereas its second cripples the enemy's abilities by disarming them or damaging their armor, and its third talent line is all about the big attacks that decimate their targets on impact. It focuses a bit more on putting the character in the damage role on the battlefield and allowing them to go one-on-one with big enemies while holding their own and whittling down the big health bars. I do want to point out also that there is a talent called Shattering Blows in the second talent line that increases the character's damage specifically against golems and constructs. It just feels weird to have two-handed weapons have a talent for a specific type of enemy, since none of the others do, and there are definitely diminishing results on taking the talent once the player gets through Orzammar and the limited content that actually includes those types of enemies. Finally, the weapon and shield talents are for warriors that need to fill the tank role, taking tons of damage and managing to stay on their feet to spare the more squishy party members from getting their shit rocked too quickly. The first talent line focuses on stunning enemies by delivering strikes with the shield, giving the character a respite from taking damage and leaving the enemy vulnerable for a short time. The second talent line is dedicated to increasing the character's defenses with the shield and decreasing the penalties their damage receives, while in modes focused on increasing defenses. The weapon's final talent line gives unique buffs to help the character counteract more varied combat encounters, like preventing them from ever being flanked and having a chance to completely block physical ranged attacks. With that out of the way, let's take a look at what makes the warrior unique, its own two talent lines. The first talent line starts with the powerful talent and is meant to give a foundation for the class through giving stamina on kills, increasing their threat level to enemies to attract more attacks, and increasing their health and resistances. The second line gives a couple stances for characters to increase or decrease how much attention they get from enemies, as well as options to give the character more attack accuracy and speed. They both are pretty basic and a tad boring, but it does a good job of guiding the player to the basic mechanics behind playing a tank role warrior effectively. So now let's look at its specializations. Specializations are unique talent lines that can only be unlocked through specific conditions, like choosing a specific quest resolution or getting close enough to a party member. This is because the party characters start with a specialization to help define them in contrast to the other party members with the same base class. Each character can have 2 specializations at a time, including party members. The core idea of finding specializations in the games world is pretty interesting to me. It helps make the process a lot more immersive and gives a bit of believability to the setting by incorporating a mechanic into the wider world. However, the mechanic flounders a bit thanks to the system of learning specializations through being close with party members. The issue with it is that players who want to get close to a party member will undoubtedly spend a lot of time with them, including closely incorporating them into their preferred party composition. With that being the case, what reason is there for a player to also learn that party member's specialization when they already have it present in their party frequently? None of the specializations are particularly better by having 2 instances of it in the party at once, so it instead encourages players to enter transactional relationships with party members, where players play with them and choose options to maximize their favor as quickly as possible, before learning their specialization and replacing them. Encouraging players to experiment with different party compositions and setups isn't a bad thing, but in a game like Origins, a system like this detracts from 2 of the title's core pillars: shaping the story and game world with one's choices, and getting to know and explore the deep characters one meets along the way. So let's look at the warrior specializations. The first is the Berserker, a talent line that focuses on the character entering a berserk mode that increases their damage at the cost of slower stamina regeneration. The middle 2 talents improve the berserk state by giving the character health regeneration while it is active, and lessening the impact on stamina regeneration. The final talent in the line is a unique one, where the character uses up all of their stamina in one big swing, with the damage it deals being increased by how much stamina was spent. Overall, the Berserker specialization is a solid one, that adds more damage potential to the warrior class on top of their tanking ability, as well as giving some more decision making for warrior players during combat. To get it, players can either have a close relationship with Ogryn or purchase a manual for it from Gorham in the market in Denerim. The second warrior specialization is Champion, a talent line that is meant to be for characters that are inspiring leaders for everyone in their party. The line is focused on 2 talents: a yell that debuffs enemies, and an activatable aura that inspires nearby allies and gives them buffs. The remaining 2 talents then increase the effectiveness of those talents and give them greater effects. I think the Champion specialization is a solid second specialization to help round out a character's kit, but it is a bit underwhelming when using it by itself. I think this is probably why no party member actually starts off with the specialization, instead leaving it to only be unlocked as a reward from Arl Eamon as a reward for curing him and saving Redcliffe. The third and arguably best warrior specialization is the Reaver, the warrior's take on blood magic. The talent line imbues the character with demons to augment their abilities and strike fear in the hearts of their enemies. It includes talents that allow the character to absorb the last fragments of life from corpses surrounding them, terrifying enemies until they cower, give the character a radiating aura of damage, and finally, a state that decreases the warrior's health regeneration but increases their damage in relation to how much health they are missing. I partially like the Reaver specialization because I'm just a sucker for blood magic and necromancy, but I do think it brings some really interesting mechanical options for warriors, while helping make them more self-sufficient on the battlefield, opening up more varied party compositions. However, it has to be unlocked by opting to taint the Urn of Sacred Ashes, after which the specialization is unlocked by Colgrim in exchange for helping the cult carry out their mission. The final specialization for warriors is the Templar, a religion-motivated warrior that specializes in countering the incredible power of magic-wielding enemies. Toward this end, its talent line adds an effect that lowers the mana of enemies the Templar hits, allows the Templar to absorb magical areas of effect to remove them from the battlefield, buffs the character's mental resistance to better avoid the effects of spells, and a huge attack that hits a group of enemies with various effects. All enemies hit by the attack have to pass a mental resistance check to avoid losing mana and taking additional damage in relation to how much mana was lost. On top of that, all enemies hit by it also have to pass a physical resistance check, otherwise they are stunned temporarily. The Templar specialization feels like a bit of a classic when it comes to Origins. This is in part because of how fondly remembered Alistair is as a companion, and the fact that he starts with the Templar specialization, but also because of how impactful it is, and how closely it ties into the storylines that the players explore during the main quest. It ties into the rest of the game a lot better than the rest of the warrior's options, just because of how much it can be seen in other characters throughout the story, as well as providing an explanation for how such a role functions in this setting. To unlock it, players either have to get very close with Alistair, or purchase a manual about it from Bodan at their party camp. So let's move on to the Rogue next, and look at everything available to that class. To start, Rogues are only able to use either the dual weapon talents and archery talents to prevent the class from trying to function in a tank-based role. They are an entirely damage-focused class with the unique ability of performing backstab attacks. When rogue characters are behind an enemy, a symbol appears on the ground around their feet to show the area the character has to be in to deal backstabs. Backstabs deal critical hit damage, but are unable to actually be classified as critical hits where it applies to status effects and such. Building rogue classes around flanking enemies is nothing new, and could work very well in synergy with the other Battlefield roles and Origins. However, it does not work at all with the game's combat AI. There is no way to input the behavior for AI companions through the game's combat tactics system, which makes it almost impossible to run a melee rogue in your party unless you want to only play as them. Without closely micromanaging their positioning and movement throughout the entire fight, they are almost worthless. The Rogue's first skill line is focused on helping the character land more backstabs for additional damage. It does this by giving the player a larger area to backstab from, letting them stun enemies, and causing all of their attacks against stun enemies to count as backstabs. The class's second talent line starts with the talent below the belt, and it is an effort to increase the class's flat damage regardless of their positioning on the battlefield. Its talents increase the character's critical hit chance, allow them to debuff the defenses of an enemy target, and gives them more armor penetration, which is great for boss fights with tankier opponents. Assumedly because of the rogue's more limited weapon choices, the class doesn't stop there, and has two additional exclusive talent lines. The class's third talent line is focused entirely on the rogue's utilitarian skills outside of combat. Each skill within it increases the character's capabilities when it comes to picking locks and disarming traps. The rogue's final line focuses on allowing them to go into stealth. At first, it allows the rogue to stay stealthed at the start of combat, while other talents let them use items while stealthed, and gives them the ability to enter stealth while in combat. The rogue's talent lines aren't bad, but they do heavily reinforce my main issue with the class, as there is no way in hell you could ever get an AI party member in Origins to go into stealth to maximize damage, on top of constantly moving around the battlefield to get backstabs. The class also heavily favors melee builds over ranged ones, even with its specializations, which is pretty disappointing. Speaking of those specializations, the rogue class has 4, so let's take a look. The first is the Assassin, which focuses entirely on increasing the rogue's lethality by doubling down on critical hits and backstabs. The line's first skill increases all damage dealt against the target from any source for a short time, while others increase backstab damage normally and with a bleeding status effect, and the last restores a modicum of the rogue's stamina if they kill an enemy with a backstab. The specialization can either be taught to the player via getting close to Zevran, or by purchasing a manual from a merchant in the alienage. Overall, it's one of my preferred rogue specializations because of how naturally it blends into the rogue standard playstyle. Picking it up makes any rogue feel like an absolute cannon, which is exactly what it should feel like. The rogue's second specialization is the bard. However, it is not a traditional bard, but actually references a long tradition in the Orlesian Empire, where bards are effectively spies and saboteurs that go through extensive and varied training to gather information, assassinate targets, and infiltrate complex social structures. The specialization's talent line focuses mostly on giving them different songs to sing during combat. They can only sing one at a time, and they give effects like increasing stamina and mana regeneration for the party, grant buffs to the party's damage, or one that stuns nearby enemies. The bard specialization can be unlocked either by getting close enough to Leliana, or by purchasing a manual from the merchant Alamar in Dusttown. If you want to run a more passive rogue character in your party, the bard is a great option. The songs don't add much of interest while actively playing a rogue, since the songs are mostly set it and forget it talents, but they are really beneficial to program an AI to run them for you. Then we have the duelist, a specialization that intends to make the rogue more of a competent fighter in singular combat, but in effect mostly feels like a half-assed extension of the class's basic talent lines. Half of its talents simply increase the character's defense, one can debuff an enemy's movement, and only the final skill is really worth it, which makes all of the rogue's attacks count as critical hits for a limited time. Honestly, that one talent can be valuable enough to make the specialization worth it if the player goes with the right build, but it does leave it feeling pretty disappointing. Interestingly, it is also one of the more involved specializations to get, requiring the player to persuade Isabella at the Pearl, or best her in a card game that is just random chance unless you lose enough to have Leliana or Zevran get sick of watching you lose and offer to just beat it for you. The rogue's final specialization is the Ranger, which gives the character a talent line that is all about summoning animals from nature to assist them in battle, making it another strong option for a less involved party member. It allows the character to summon a wolf, a bear, and a giant spider, with its final talent increasing the abilities of each one. It feels like a bit of an odd addition to the base rogue class, but it does provide a fun way for the class to set up backstabs or cover weaknesses in the party's composition. The only way to get it, however, is by buying a manual from Bodan Fedek in your camp. Alright, to wrap this section up, let's take a look at the mage class, which is the biggest and most varied of the three. Instead of talents, mages have access to spells, although they work effectively the same, just with their resource being called mana instead of stamina. The sheer size of the mage class comes purely from the sheer volume of spells they have available to them, which can be a real bitch and a half to work into a comprehensive list of commands for your AI companions. There are a total of 4 schools of spells that every mage has access to, each one holding 3 or 4 spell lines with options to unlock. Add on top of that 4 specializations that each add another additional spell line, and the build options start getting vast, which can make running 2 mages in a party very enticing. Outside of the 4 magic schools, there is a base spell line called Mastery that is intended to be the starting point for every mage. Its spells include a basic ranged blast, a shield to offer some brief protection, and then 2 passive buffs that increase the mage's use of staves and spells. The schools are where things really start to get fun though. Now, I'm a huge heal slut, so I want to start with the Creation School, which is all about spells that heal and buff your allies with some light summoning and debuffs through glyphs sprinkled in. Having a mage with the Creation School as a focus can be paramount for parties that require a lot of healing, and is nearly an absolute necessity on the hardest difficulty. Because of how singularly focused it is also one of the easiest schools to focus on with a mage party member that you don't want to play as too much, as the combat tactics system handles healing conditions quite well. Its buffs and debuffs also work well and are easy to control, but its summoning spell line does feel like an afterthought. It makes sense for summoning to be part of creation, but it doesn't really fit in with the other options in the school, or many of the mage's options at all, really. I would recommend going to Ranger Rogue instead if you really wanted to summon animals to fight alongside you. The second school is Entropy, a destructive school that focuses on shelling out pure damage and tearing enemies apart with debuffs and exploiting their weaknesses. It is the best school to use if you want your mage to really focus on crowd control, but it does come with the caveat of generating a lot of threat, meaning that enemies will get really pissed off and will want to target your squishy mage after you cast some of your biggest spells. Luckily, its spells like Mass Paralysis, Disorient, and Sleep can help you keep them from ever reaching you. Then there is also the Primal School of Spells, which is a fun way of saying Elemental. Split into Cold, Earth, Fire, and Lightning, The Primal School is focused on giving the mage options to adapt to any combat encounter or enemy that they may come across. The elemental spells here don't have fun interactions like they do in, say, Divinity Original Sin, as they instead focus on allowing the mage to change their approach and attack options depending on each enemy's weaknesses. This can really help if you want to rely on your mage as a primary damage dealer for your party, but it does require you to play them constantly, as the AI doesn't properly prioritize spells or identify which ones are most appropriate to use for any given opponent. The final school is Spirit, which is a varied bunch of spells that feel like Dragon Age's attempt to create a more stereotypically arcane feeling school. The Spirit School has a lot of good options in it, with spells to buff allies and yourself, enchant weapons for better damage output, and to damage enemies directly. It also has a spell line that is entirely dedicated to besting other magic users, allowing you to create shields that are more effective against magic attacks, to cancel other mages' spells, and to suck mana right out of them. Now, let's talk about the specialization options. The first we need to look at is the Arcane Warrior, an ancient type of combatant that dates back to nearly lost elven cultures. This makes them exceptionally rare to find in modern Thedas, but they are out there. I do find it a bit disappointing that this specialization doesn't have anything to allow mages to use weapons or play a hybrid role, though. Instead, it mostly focuses on increasing their survivability by granting more shield spells and a passive buff that allows mages to use their magic attribute instead of strength when it comes to requirements to equip armor. It can be kind of fun to see a mage kitted out in full plate mail on the battlefield, but it also isn't very useful, since enemies shouldn't even be getting close to you often if you're playing the class well. To unlock the lost secrets of the Arcane Warrior, you have to find an abandoned phylactery in the Elven Ruins during the Nature of the Beast main questline. Inside of it, the player can talk to the soul of a trapped elf and help them in exchange for unlocking the specialization, which is a really cool way to introduce it thematically. Then you also have the option of picking up the Dark Forbidden Art of the Blood Mage. The main standout of this spell line is its last unlock, Blood Control. The spell allows you to take control of an enemy's blood, forcing them to fight alongside the party for a limited time. Apart from that, it gives the player the option to heal by sucking life from an ally, to use hit points instead of mana to cast spells, and to stun enemies in a sizable area by making their blood boil. While the specialization spells have a lot of fun flavor, they aren't actually that useful or universally appealing, which lessens the specialization's impact since it is talked up throughout the game as this extremely powerful ability that all mages are tempted to take up for the power it yields. Picking the Blood Mage specialization can work really well, but mostly if your character is struggling to consistently cast spells because of low mana, or if you like having a lot of passive spells active that generally lower your maximum mana to begin with. The Blood Mage specialization can only be unlocked when the player enters the Fade to confront the Desire Demon during the Arl of Redcliffe main questline. There, the player will offer to teach the player character in exchange for being let off the hook. The Mage's third specialization is the Shapeshifter, which allows them to transform into triage of different creatures. This is the best specialization in Origins to go with if you want to play a mage that gets up in the thick of combat and doesn't have to just sit back in the back lines and worry about being hit too hard. Its spells allow one to transform into a giant spider, a bear, and a swarm of insects. Each has its own benefits, with the spider dealing high singular damage over time, the bear acting as a strong tank, and the insect swarm dealing damage to all surrounding enemies consistently, which makes this specialization very adaptable to situations. The final spell in its line further upgrades the forms, making them much stronger and more sustainable during fights. However, once a mage has shifted, they are unable to cast spells until they revert back to their normal form, so it doesn't go well at all with a mage that is also intended to be your healer or any type of support build. To learn how to be a shapeshifter, the player can either get close to Morrigan, or they can purchase a manual at the Dalish camp. Alright, the last specialization we have until we go over the expansion Awakening is the Spirit Healer, which, you guessed it, turns any mage into a bona fide mercy. It comes with a great group heal spell, a revival spell, a spell that lies dormant until the character is about to die and then releases a burst of healing, and finally, an activatable aura that sends out healing pulses to nearby allies. Overall, the Spirit Healer is an extremely powerful specialization, and is great for keeping any party alive or helping a player recover from possible mistakes they make in battle. Interestingly, the companion Wynn starts out with this specialization, but she won't actually teach it to the player even if they become best buddies. The only way to unlock it is by purchasing a manual from a shop in Denerim. Now that we have a thorough understanding of the options that players have when it comes to building characters in Origins, how well does it work? Generally, I would say it's decent. There aren't enough options in the game to give the depth or exciting level of experimentation that other titles offer, but it does give players enough options for each class to feel a bit different, even if you play with it multiple times or have more than one in your party. I think the biggest problem with the way builds work is how unbalanced a lot of it feels. Rogues feel like they have a much more restrictive design ethos than even warriors, while mages feel like 2 or 3 entire classes crammed into one. The system also comes off much more restrictive than I would like. Making any class that uses a bow and arrow is generally a waste of time, while it is easy for warriors to feel very similar unless you put a lot of effort into diversifying a build to set it apart from the others. Having to unlock specializations through gameplay is also a really neat feature that I like in theory, but I do wish that the game gave you a bit more direction on how to do so. If a new player jumped into Origins now, completely blind, I could see them easily going through the game without ever learning a specialization, especially since the most natural way to get one is by befriending party members. But they may not want to have a party member with them that is the same class they are playing, making it much more difficult to do so. I also wish that specializations carried more impact with them than a singular line of 4 talents or spells. Playing specializations like a Blood Mage or a Templar feels like it should be an extremely impactful choice that largely defines your character's entire lifestyle and abilities, but with the system's implementation here, it feels at best like a footnote, and at worst, like it is completely irrelevant. Perhaps one of the most important parts of any BioWare game is the companions that players travel alongside or throughout their time with the game. While playing companions are able to provide natural insight into the game's setting, can influence a player's choices with their own opinions, and, at their best, can form real feeling relationships with the player that have entire arcs for them to go through and appreciate. Just think of how impactful Garrus from the Mass Effect series is. He's the poster child for great character writing and fuckable alien daddies alike, as players can explore an intricately written relationship with him across 3 games that is as rewarding as it is morally and emotionally challenging. So with all of that in mind, I think it is important to take a really comprehensive look at each of the 10 companions in Dragon Age Origins. Not all of them are as deep or as well done as their peers, but I still think it is worth looking at their personal stories and personalities that players can experience throughout the game. I'm not going to do them in any particular order, so let's just go with alphabetical. I'm also going to ignore the likes of Duncan and any short-term companions during the player's chosen origin or the tutorial section when they first fight the Darkspawn, as I don't think that would really add anything here, since they don't have complete personalities or side storylines for players to experience. Although I would be interested to know what Duncan would have felt about me running that kid through with my sword. The first full party member that players meet, unless they choose the human noble origin, is Alistair, a big whiny baby masquerading as a Templar warrior in Grey Warden armor. Jokes aside, Alistair is one of the franchise's biggest characters, appearing in all 3 mainline games, multiple pieces of side content, and numerous comics. In Origins, he functionally attempts to fill the role of the player's closest peer and best friend. He joins the player after fighting alongside them when King Loghain betrays the Grey Wardens and King Cailan in the battle at Ostagar. Once Duncan is killed there, the player and Alistair become the last Grey Wardens in Ferelden, pushing the 2 toward a fraternal bond. Alistair's intended importance to the player is also reinforced by his extreme importance to the story, that is really only comparable to that of Morrigan. As we talked about during the main questline section, this is because of his secret identity as a bastard son of King Merrick, putting him in a unique position to challenge Loghain's claim to rule. When I first played Origins when I was younger, and it had first come out in 2009, I really liked Alistair. He constantly undercuts moments with dry sarcasm, has a relatively standard moral compass, and has an interesting backstory of leaving the Chantry just before taking his vows, allowing him to avoid the lyrium addiction that plagues most Templars. However, going back to Origins now, Alistair really fits into the character archetype that has become popular since the explosive popularity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He isn't as exaggerated as a late-stage Joss Whedon character, but his constant quips and witticisms can get a bit grating, especially when they keep popping up during important or emotional conversations. However, this is helped by his interesting backstory and the more serious moments that writer David Gayden does allow him to have. So let's look at how playing with Alistair in one's party actually impacts the game. Obviously, Alistair starts with the Templar specialization, as well as a sword and shield, making him a prime candidate for the party's tank. He will also eventually ask the player for help with his companion quest, which begins with a request for the player to track down his half-sister in Denerim, Goldana. Goldana can be found in the Market District of Denerim, where she works as a washer in a constant struggle to support her handful of children. While Alistair hoped for the reunion to be a joyous one, he discovers that Guldana's struggle has made her jealous and vindictive toward her half-brother, which is completely understandable. She rebukes his attempts to express his affection toward her, even if the player gives her money to help her out like she requests. His relationship with Guldana cannot be salvaged, but the player can opt to change Alistair's personality by giving him the hardened trait, if they give him some tough love and enforcing that everyone in the world is just out to get themselves ahead. This will change his outlook on the world to prioritize his duty and honor, pushing down his personal preferences and desires in the process. This is particularly good to do if you want to make Alistair king, as it will make him much more amiable to the concept. The hardened trait can also allow the player to become Alistair's queen if they are playing any character other than a human noble. Speaking of romancing Alistair, he is only interested in female wardens. Alistair is pretty explicit about his lack of experience when it comes to intimate relationships, requiring the player to consistently compliment and flirt with him without teasing him or mocking that lack of experience. Interestingly, if the player also has too high of a relationship with Zevran or Leliana, Alistair will demand that the player choose between only one of them, but he is willing to have a threesome with the player and Isabella if the player has already had sex with him before meeting her. The most interesting part of Alistair's romance, however, is the possibility for the player to join him as his queen, which is the most important role the player character can end up in at the end of Origins. Dog is one of two companions that do not fit into the usual structure of having a class and a specialization. Instead, Dog is unable to equip any gear other than exclusive collars, and he has his own unique set of talent lines to pick from when leveling up, although he is categorized as a warrior. Dog is most easily recruited by starting with the human noble origin, but he can also be recruited after the battle at Ostagar. Once the battle is done, the player will find Dog after his owner was killed during the battle. However, with this option, Dog is afflicted with the Taint, giving the player the option to outright reject breeding him in case he turns into a Darkspawn, or just killing him outright. However, the player can also opt to instead cure Dog, allowing him to join the party for good. Since Dog doesn't have a traditional specialization that we already covered, I want to take a look at his unique talent lines. Dog's options really focus on increasing his survivability in lieu of equipping him with better gear as one progresses through the game, and various options for crowd control through knocking enemies down, frightening them with howls, and making enemies bleed. It is an interesting combination, even though his lack of customizability or voice lines does make him feel like a lesser character than other party options. This isn't to say that Dog is completely unable to be interacted with, though. Players can interact with him at their party camp to start some fun scenes with Dog and other members, with Dog becoming particularly fond of Sten throughout the game.
You are a true warrior and worthy of respect.
The scenes do a really great job of giving Dog more personality, which is fun to see when compared to other games like Fable 2 that have dog companions that don't end up being anything more than a standard canine. Dog also comes with two unique abilities, finding items and marking landmarks. Landmarks are special areas spread throughout the regions of Origins that can be activated while Dog is in the party. Doing so gives him a +2 to his strength, willpower, and constitution attributes whenever he is in that area. He can also be asked to look around for items in the majority of spots in the game, which results in him coming back with common consumables or special items in specific areas like gifts and alchemical resources. Next is Leliana, the rogue bard chantry member that can join the player in Lothering. She was originally born in Orlais, but to a Ferelden mother, resulting in her feeling a special bond with Ferelden culture. When she grew up, she was slyly taught the way of bards through her mentor. However, that mentor ended up betraying Leliana and her friends after guiding them toward a life of crime, resulting in Leliana's friend being killed. Her guilt over the death of her friend pushed Leliana to join the Chantry in search of redemption. This saw Leliana becoming fervently religious to the degree that her devotion was even mocked by other religious members. This led to her travel to the Chantry in Lothering, where she received a vision from the Maker that she claims instructed her to join the Warden to help end the Blight. At the core of Leliana's character is a conflict between her religious devotion and desire to follow the moral teachings of the Chantry, and the more devious and underhanded nature of her skills that she revels in using. This sets her up as a very interesting party member. She has very strict moral principles that she refuses to deviate early on, while also allowing the player to pull off some more underhanded actions in pursuit of the greater good. Exploring her internal tumult is also explored well through numerous emotional dialogue sections. Leliana's companion quest is aptly called Leliana's Past, and sees the player helping her get revenge against the woman that betrayed her, Marjolaine. The quest starts when the party is attacked by assassins during a random encounter that were sent by Marjolaine to kill Leliana for good. This eventually points the player to a hideout in Denerim, where they confront Marjolaine. The player can then opt to either join Leliana in scolding Marjolaine to try and keep her out of Leliana's life, or persuading Leliana to kill her. Killing her can help the player get the unique bow for Leliana called Marjolaine's Recurve, but either option does not impact the story repercussions of the quest. Afterward, the player can also give Leliana the Harden trait through some tough love similar to Alistair. Doing so makes her much less morally strict, stopping the player from losing favor with her through more questionable or brutal decisions, as well as allowing the player to intimidate her out of turning against them if they decide to taint the Urn of Sacred Ashes. Leliana is also a romance option available to both genders of wardens. However, she is wholly disinterested in having a purely sexual relationship and is in search of love. This means that she will only enter any type of relationship with the warden once she is in love with them. However, she is willing to have a threesome with Isabella if she is in a relationship with the player, and she will even let Zevran join if he is willing. This does mean that romancing Leliana takes a lot of dedication on the player's part by completing her quest, adhering to her morals consistently, giving her gifts, and frequently talking to her whenever possible. Loghain is one of the more surprising party members in Origins, to the degree that I didn't even know he was possible to recruit until my playthrough for this video. As discussed while we were covering the main questline of Origins, Loghain can only be recruited after the player dethrones him, but it does result in Alistair refusing to stay with the group. Toward this end, Loghain acts as almost a direct replacement for Alistair in terms of combat. He is a warrior, although he wields a two-handed sword when first recruited, rather than a sword and shield like Alistair does. Loghain plays a very important role in the history of Ferelden leading up to Origins, as he was largely responsible for helping lead the rebellion that gained the country's independence. However, his history has made him innately distrustful of anyone that he isn't intimately familiar with, incredibly harsh to all around him, and highly valuing independence and personal ability. However, Loghain joining the party so late in the game sees his interactions with the player being very limited. He does not have a personal quest, cannot be romanced, and doesn't get along with any other party members other than Dog. However, he can also be used to give his life to kill the Archdemon, or to sleep with Morrigan to save his and the player's life, which can make him pretty useful if the player wants to survive the end of the main questline. If he makes it to the end of the game, he ends up becoming a devoted member of the Grey Wardens, going so far as being appointed as the group's recruiter in Ferelden to help the Order recover from his own betrayal. Alphabetical order then brings us to Origin's resident companion for Boobing Boobily, Morrigan. As mentioned earlier, Morrigan is the second companion to join the player when her mother Flemeth pushes her to go with the Warden and assist them in preventing the Blight. As an apostate mage, she comes with a shapeshifter specialization and has a general distrust for everything, including her mother. She cares little for moral quandaries or the established order of things, often delighting in the Warden shirking those concepts or mocking them for failing to do so. After she has traveled with the Warden for a while, Morrigan will ask for help with a delicate matter, obtaining Flemeth's Black Grimoire. Morrigan will reveal to the player that it was stolen from her long ago and taken to the Circle Tower. Otherwise, the player can also find it there, and bring it to her to start the quest as well. After giving Morrigan the Grimoire, she will request some time to thoroughly study it, only to eventually tell the player that it wasn't actually a magical tome that she could use to grow in power. Instead, it is more like a journal that explains Flemeth's seeming immortality. Rather than just having found a secret to avoid aging, the Grimoire reveals that Flemeth actually raises daughters like Morrigan, only to use a dark ritual to take over their body, assuring that she manages to live on in a younger form. To prevent Flemeth from doing just that to her, she requests the Warden's help in killing her. One thing I like is that the player can actually refuse to help Morrigan here, resulting in her leaving the party only to reappear later to request a baby being put into her. If the player decides to help Morrigan, they are instructed to head to Flemeth's hut without Morrigan, to prevent Flemeth's soul from entering her after her defeat. When the player reaches Flemeth's hut, she knows why they have returned, and turns into a proper dragon to protect herself. The fight can be exceptionally difficult if the player is not properly prepared, but once she is killed, the player will find her real Grimoire, which can then be returned to Morrigan at the party camp. There is an option to keep the Grimoire for yourself, but there is no use for it, other than giving it to Morrigan, which is pretty disappointing. Giving Morrigan the real Grimoire also only results in her saying that she will be able to use it to defend herself from Flemeth's magic if the witch did manage to survive the battle through some nefarious means on top of getting some favor with her as well. The player is also able to romance Morgan apart from having sex with her just before facing the Archdemon. When first approaching Morgan in that way, she will react only with sarcasm or mock boredom, but enough tenacity and an increased relationship will result in her hard facade eventually giving way to a more stereotypically girly disposition, much to the mocking retorts of Alistair. The player is then able to sleep with her at the party camp, resulting in her getting pregnant even if they don't accept her offer to have a baby for the Archdemon's soul to inhabit in Redcliffe Castle. Through romancing her, she also gives the player a unique ring that emotionally ties the two together, allowing the player to still sense her state even after she inevitably leaves the party to do some sus shit after defeating the Archdemon. I do have a soft spot for Morgan because of how enamored I was with her when I was younger, but I think her character does hold up even now. Her utilitarian philosophy offers an interesting contrast to most other party members in Origins, while the slow reveal of her personality as the player gets to know her is always a fun dynamic in storytelling. The jabbing dynamic that she has with Alistair is also a lot of fun, which makes it unsurprising that the quote-unquote default party composition in Origins is the two of them together with Leliana to create a diverse tangle of perspectives and backgrounds. Then there is Oghren, the red-haired alcoholic berserker dwarf that joins the player in Orzammar to venture into the Deep Roads. Oghren was actually married to the paragon Branka that players hunt down in the Deep Roads, explaining his determination in coming with them. However, Branka's rise to paragonhood strained their marriage, as the pressure eroded Oghren and pushed him deeper into his alcoholism. The two eventually lost contact with one another, which caused Oghren's house to wholly ignore him. His status as one of the most skilled warriors in the city quickly fell apart until he was little more than a drunken laughingstock, driving him to desperately join the Warden in search of Branka for redemption. He is eventually horrified to discover what Branka has become, and once a new king is elected in Orzammar, he recognizes the lack of anything keeping him in the Mountain City, which pushes him to join the Warden on their quest. Overall, Oghren is a bitter party member that is grizzled and cynical after being largely abandoned by his family and culture. He is quick to anger, which frequently comes up in combat with him going into a blind rage of violence. While he is still a capable warrior and has a lot to offer the members of his party, getting him to do so requires opening him up to the possibility of finding self-worth again. Oghren is also unable to be romanced by the Warden, but he does have a companion quest called Oghren's Old Flame. The quest revolves around Felsi, a previous love of Oghren's that he pushed away by showing up drunk to her father's funeral and causing a big scene after he lost Branka. Afterwards, she went to the surface, to the inn on the shore of Lake Calenhead to be specific, and Oghren tells the Warden that he keeps thinking about whether or not she has forgiven him over the years. However, to get Oghren to agree to go see her, the Warden cannot just agree to do so, but instead has to press Oghren to give them more information to pierce through his thick emotional exterior. When the player travels to the inn, they are given the opportunity to play wingman for Oghren, to decide how their relationship ends up. If the player wants Oghren and Felsi to end up together, they have to talk him up. Otherwise, they have to make fun of him and speak negatively of him to dissuade Felsi from acting on her feelings for him. If Oghren ends up with Felsi, they end up married at the end of the game, with a child named in honor of the Warden, and Oghren becomes a general for the humans. If he doesn't end up with Felsi, he can either end up as a general still, with some encouragement from the Warden, or he can end up as a lone drunk that doesn't amount to anything. Now let's talk about Shale, a stoic golem companion that comes with some controversy, as he is only available in the Stone Prisoner DLC that came for free with new copies of the game. BioWare has used DLC companions throughout both the Dragon Age and Mass Effect franchises, but they tend to usually be half-baked companions that don't boast the depth, personality, or integration throughout the game as basic companions. However, Shale actually feels right at home in Origins. He has just as many interactions as the base game companions, has a personal quest, an interesting recruitment process, and unique talent lines similar to Dog. However, this does possibly indicate that Shale was originally developed to be included in Origins normally, only to be carved off as a DLC to try and make extra money off of secondhand copies of the game, which is gross if true. To unlock Shale, players have to travel to the village of Hanleith, where he is frozen after being used for study by a mage named Wilhelm, after he was used to fight alongside King Maric in the rebellion that led to Ferelden's independence from the Orlesian Empire. Eventually, Shale was found frozen over Wilhelm's dead body, leading the villagers to assume that the golem was responsible for his murder, leading to Shale's control rod being sold out of the hope of avoiding his activation. Shale stood frozen in the village for decades, although he was still conscious and paid constant attention to his surroundings and the events within them. The player then eventually meets a merchant named Felix that is willing to sell the golem's control rod to the player, allowing them to travel to Hanleith and activate him. If the player takes Shale with them when they find the Anvil of the Void, Caridin will fill them in on Shale's history and restore the golem's memories. However, Shale does turn on the player if they side with Branka during the final fight of that quest. On the Wall of Converted Dwarves, the players can also find Shale's real name, Shale with a Y, that reveals that Shale was originally a female dwarf belonging to House Kadash. This is an interesting twist because of how masculine presenting Shale is as a golem, making for some really solid LBGT representation for a video game, especially when released back in 2009. This discovery also constitutes Shale's companion quest, even requiring the player to travel back to the Anvil of the Void after completing the associated main quest if the player accepts Shale's quest afterward. At the end of the game, Shale expresses her intent to travel to Minrathos to speak with the mages there in search of a way to revert the process of becoming a golem, which the player can offer to accompany her on. With Shale's unique combat abilities and equipment options, I also want to look at those. Shale's sheer size prevents her from utilizing any standard gear, instead leaving her to equip small and large crystals on her wrists and shoulders respectively. Equipping small crystals modifies her attacks with different elemental types, making her a very adaptable warrior. Meanwhile, the large crystals increase her elemental resistances, which also helps her stay alive against particularly powerful enemies that favor elemental attacks. This allows her to fulfill a strong tank role in the party, especially if you don't want to have Alistair whining behind you all the time. Shale also comes with 4 unique talent lines that allow the player to cater her toward different playstyles. She can either be bent more toward dealing damage through elemental attacks and armor penetration, or to act more defensively and protective of her party members. Her talent lines also come with the unique quality of providing passive buffs to her attributes and regeneration of stamina and health when they are fully completed. This brings us to Sten, the slight introduction that Origins gives the player to the Qunari race, although he is unusual in that he was born without horns. However, he does align with many elements of Qunari culture, such as his stern demeanor, his high valuation of respect in his relationships and actions with others, and his lack of personal identity, exemplified by how Sten is not actually a personal name, but instead a rank within his vanguard unit known as the Bir Assad. Sten is also a missable companion, with the player having to recruit him after finding him locked in a cage in Lothering. To recruit him, the player has to convince the local chantry to release him into their custody, whether it is to allow him some form of redemption, or under the assumption that he will most likely die in pursuit of ending the Blight anyways. Sten is a proud warrior that comes with no specialization and points already invested in 2-handed talent lines, indicating that he is built more for damage than tanking. When he first joins the party, he is very standoffish and prefers to seclude himself from others. When the player talks with him, he will take command of the conversation and refuse to talk about any subjects that he doesn't want to. As the player earns his respect, however, he will begin to open up, peeling back the curtain slightly on Qunari culture, his history, and his personality. In the end, he is revealed to be a pragmatic fatalist that believes every person's role in the world is to fully embrace the path that fate has set them on. Overall, he provides an especially interesting perspective on the world of Thedas, as his culture collides so completely with that of the world's other races. However, this does prevent him from getting too close to any party members other than the Warden if they play a particular way, or Dog, who he quickly develops a deep compassion for. Sten is also wholly unable to be romanced by the player, but does offer a personal quest once they have earned enough of his trust. The quest begins with Sten revealing that he was imprisoned in Lothering after losing his sword, which the Qunari believe to be equivalent to their soul. Without his sword, he is unable to return to his homeland, leaving him stranded in Ferelden, helpless and searching. The sheer panic of losing his sword threw him into a blind rage that ended in him killing an innocent family. When he awoke afterward, he was horrified at what he had done and turned himself in to atone for it. At this point, the player can offer to help Sten find his sword, kicking off the quest, The Sword of the Bir Assad. The search begins by heading to the docks of Lake Calenhad, as that is the last spot where Sten remembers having it, where the player finds a scavenger that claims to have purchased looting rights for the area from a merchant in Orzammar. After heading there, the player is able to confront the merchant to learn that Sten's sword was sold to a mercenary. The mercenary can then be tracked down to Redcliffe, where he has a house. From there, the player can get the sword by talking their way through it, passing an intimidate check, paying some more money, killing Dwyn the mercenary, or just waiting until after the Battle of Redcliffe as his house will be empty. This solidifies Sten's relationship with the Warden as the two form a strong bond of respect and cooperation. However, Sten's relationship with the Warden can turn sour if he is in the party when the player travels to the village of Haven. There he attempts to take control of the party, and the player is forced to talk him down, otherwise resulting in a fight between the two that can only end in his leaving the party. One thing that I especially love about this interaction is that the player's interactions with Sten up to that point all factor in, including whether or not they have completed his quest and his approval rating of them. Regardless of the player's ending, Sten opts to return to the Qunari homeland, with the only difference being whether or not the Warden has the opportunity to travel there with him. I do wish that there were a variant or two to accommodate Sten not having a very strong relationship with the Warden, as no matter what he tells the Qunari that the only honorable person he met in Ferelden was the Warden, especially because he is such a more opinionated character than most of the other party members. But that's just how it is. So, I already talked about recruiting Wynne during the Circle of Mages main quest, so we can skip over that part. When Wynne joins the Warden, she is a powerful mage that comes with a Spirit Healer specialization. Before Origins, Wynne was found nameless and abandoned as a child by a small family of farmers. They raised her with a lot of care and love until she lashed out with fire magic as a young child, when getting bullied by another kid. This led to her being spirited away to the Circle of Mages for close watching and training. At the Circle, she proved to be an excellent student, with natural abilities that led her to dedicate her life to stalwartly serving the Circle. This went so far as her being asked to become the first enchanter, although she ultimately refused the honor to avoid getting bogged down in the bureaucracy and politics of the upper echelon of mages. She always gravitated toward the healing arts of magic, and that is completely reflected in her role within the party, as she starts with such a strong disposition toward it. Wynne's character is one of dedication, secure values, and a deep desire to make the world a better place. Her amiability toward rules and power structures leads to her clashing with Morgan on numerous occasions, and her strongly held beliefs also makes her the companion with the most opportunities to turn against the player. There are numerous occasions where the player can opt to side with the Templars during the quest in the Circle of Mages, and if they do at any point, Wynne will fight them to try and stop them from enacting the Rite of Annulment. However, Wynne will also turn on the player if they decide to taint the Urn of Sacred Ashes. I really like this detail of her character, as it feels right in line with her personality, while also giving tangible consequences to some of the player's decisions. Wynne is yet another companion that the player is unable to romance during Origins, but she does come with her personal quest. The quest, titled Wynne's Regret, starts during a random encounter the player will get thrown into, after which Wynne will collapse to the ground in exhaustion. When she awakens, she explains to the player that she was actually killed just before the player met her. She claims to have only survived by a spirit from the Fade entering her, which she has had to keep in check to stop herself from turning into an abomination so she can help the Warden stop the Blight. The inevitable mortality of her state eventually leads to the Warden being able to ask her if she has any regrets that she wants to set straight before she dies. She says that she has only one, an elf apprentice named Aniran that she worries she pushed away from the Circle by being too hard on him, damning him to a life on the run as an apostate. The player then offers to help track him down, after which she says that he is probably with a group of Dalish elves after expressing interest in their way of life as an apprentice. Well, we know where to find Dalish elves, so after heading to the Brasilian forest, the player can track down Aniran so that Wynne can have a conversation with him. It turns out that Aniran has not harbored any negative emotions towards Wynne at all, allowing the two of them to reconcile their differences then and there. Wynne offers to try and get Aniran back into the Circle so that he can help shape it in a more positive way as it rebuilds, but he is understandably reticent to commit to anything at the time. However, he does give Wynne an amulet as a token of gratitude. One fascinating part of this companion quest, too, is that it actually has a mechanical impact on Wynne. Wynne has a unique ability called Vessel of the Spirit due to her condition that disorients nearby enemies and instantly recovers half of her mana and health, although it does stun her after 10 seconds. It is a great ability when in a pinch, and completing her companion quest makes it even better by allowing it to fully recover her mana instantly and preventing it from stunning her at all. This brings us to our final companion and the last topic for the base game portion of this video, the elf assassin Zevran, that comes from the nation of Antiva. As a young brothel-raised orphan, Zevran was purchased to join the elite group of assassins known as the Antivan Crows. There he made a close bond with two other recruits, and eventually entered a throuple relationship with them. Again, some really great representation for any game, much less one released in 2009. However, Zevran was eventually tricked along with one of his companions by the name of Taliesin to kill their third love to prevent her from being used as a threat to the throne. This broke Zevran's spirit, resulting in Taliesin having to repeatedly cover for him within the organization, and ultimately ending with Zevran accepting a contract to go kill the Warden in Ferelden as a suicide attempt. This is how the Warden first meets him, when Zevran ambushes the party in a plot-based random encounter. Once the group is defeated, Zevran is left wounded on the ground where he offers to help the Warden instead of being killed. The player has the option of killing him outright, letting him go free or accepting his offer of help. As part of the party, Zevran is an unabashed delight. While most of the party does not trust him because of his occupation, Zevran shows little care or interest in gaining their affections. Instead, he is endlessly confident and open to talking about his past as a hired killer without any shame or lies. He also is the least judgmental of all the companions in the game, often accepting any warped morality that the Warden offers for their actions and decisions. However, he does have some issues that he cares deeply about, mostly when it comes to sparing innocents or throwing away resources that could be useful for their effort against the Blight. Zevran does not come with a personal quest, but during the Landsmeet there is a unique scene that tests how dedicated he is to the Warden and their cause. The scene comes when the party is confronted by a group of Antivan crows led by none other than Taliesin, who offers to take Zevran back to Antiva to continue their work and love life together. If the player has not cemented a strong enough relationship with Zevran, at this point he will accept Taliesin's offer, proving the player's other companions right. However, he can also announce that he will stay alongside the Warden and instead fight back, killing his last tie to the crows in the process, or opt to stay out of the battle entirely because he doesn't want to pick a side. If Zevran survives the battle, he will tell the player that the crows will undoubtedly assume that he died during the battle alongside Taliesin, providing him a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to run into hiding before the organization learns that he betrayed them. If the player's approval rating with him is not high enough, he will use the opportunity to ask the player to let him go, so that he can hide for the rest of his days, whereas a high enough approval rating will see him further dedicating himself to the cause of stopping the Blight. Zevran is also a romance option for both genders of Warden, and is one of the most flirtatiously forward characters in the game. Lore-wise, he is said to be a master of seduction, which is shown in-game by him constantly flirting with anything that moves, often as just a joke. Almost immediately after joining the party, he can be romanced by the player, making very forward and explicit advances toward him, and he will only really stop making advances himself if the player outright expresses their disinterest in him to his face. At least he understands that no means no. After the player sleeps with Zevran, however, he offers to let the player end there if they wish. Interestingly, if the player expresses love for him, he doesn't like it, but he also doesn't like the player saying that it meant nothing or was a one-night stand. This sets up an interesting dynamic of Zevran struggling with his growing feelings for the Warden as it goes against how he sees himself. Through the relationship, he discovers that he deserves love and is capable of receiving and reciprocating it, as long as the Warden fosters emotional growth. Eventually, Zevran will refuse to have sex with the player after struggling with his feelings. When the player confronts him, they then have to confess their own love to him for him to come around to the idea of attempting a more serious relationship. This complicated dynamic with Zevran also lends itself to a range of ending options. If the player dies in killing the Archdemon, Zevran will go on to live his own life, with the caveat that he never loved another again. Otherwise, if the Warden survives the fight, there are a few options for Zevran's conclusion to play out. The first is for Zevran to assist the Warden in rebuilding the Grey Wardens, although he never undertakes the joining himself. Other options allow the player to take up a domestic life with Zevran and Denerim, a Dalish clan, or just travel around the world together. The final option, however, is for Zevran to stay on as a side piece for the player if they opt to marry Alistair or Anora to become a ruler of Ferelden. With that choice, he does not seem bothered by the idea of sharing the Warden romantically, but he does require the player to reiterate their commitment to him to do so. Ultimately, the Companions of Origins are a really great and diverse crowd. There's a lot to love and be challenged by with the cast as a whole, and I really appreciate how many different perspectives they offer the player. It also may seem weird to say so, but I enjoy how different they are in mechanical implications. Not having every character have a personal quest, or every personal quest following a similar formula or duration, helps make it feel more natural to find them during a playthrough. The game's dedication to giving companions reasons to leave the party is also something I appreciate, as it helps the characters and setting feel more alive and mature. I think the biggest testament to the strength of the game's cast, however, is the sheer variety of opinions one can find amongst the game's community about each and every cast member. Just a brief look on old forums and discussions of each of them reveals a spectrum of opinions. This style of writing works wonders to make believable characters rather than just opting to write options that will never annoy or be disagreeable to someone. It is impossible to ever like everyone you meet or to always be agreeable, and I think Origins does this in a way that is much more realistic than almost any other game that I have played. The success of Dragon Age Origins motivated BioWare and Electronic Arts to release a slate of DLCs to support the RPG after its initial launch. When including the Stone Prisoner DLC that added Shale to the game at launch, it received a total of 8 DLC packs. However, I'm not going to cover any of these here in this video. I ultimately decided to not do this because each of the packs are extremely short, lasting only around 30 minutes to maybe an hour or two. None of them add any particularly interesting gameplay elements, and the story content they contain is pretty minimal, with most of it not adding much substance to the game's wider story. What relevant information they do contain, I have already covered earlier in this video, while I intend to cover any lore that wasn't pertinent to Origins, if and when it comes up in the other videos for this series. What I do want to cover, however, is the game's only expansion, Dragon Age: Origins - Awakening, just in case you weren't happy with just one subtitle. Overall, Awakening acts as a final chapter to the story of Origins that takes advantage of the groundwork in mechanics and visuals that the main title established. However, the expansion does also add new skills, enemies, companions, gear tiers, and even some specializations, while also raising the level cap and giving the player a new region to explore while completing the story. Before we get into the more granular additions, let's take a look at that story. Awakening opens up around a year after the conclusion of Origins, with the player following a new Warden commander of the Grey Wardens in Ferelden. When starting the expansion, the player can import an endgame save from the base game to carry over their character and decisions, or they can make an entirely new character from the ground up. To begin rebuilding the Order and the Nation, the Warden commander travels to an old fortress known as Vigil's Keep that was given to the Order in the wake of the Fifth Blight as compensation for their heroics. Vigil's Keep stands near the Arlene of Amaranthine, giving the Wardens control of that city and the surrounding keeps, villages, and countless acres of farm fields. At the start of the expansion, the player follows the Warden commander as they arrive at Vigil's Keep, only to find that it has been attacked by Darkspawn, leading to the vast majority of soldiers stationed there from the Orlesian Grey Wardens being found slaughtered. Upon arriving, the Warden commander immediately goes into full Grey Warden mode and starts slaying dozens of Darkspawn, rescuing the few survivors held within and reclaiming the fortress. Along the way, the player discovers that Oghren from Origins is at the fortress to join the Order, as well as meeting new characters like the apostate mage Anders, the seneschal responsible for helping run Vigil's Keep Veril, the captain of the keep's guard Garavel, and the Glavanac brothers. The Glavanacs are two dwarves that assist the player in rebuilding Vigil's Keep after it has been reclaimed, with Voldrick focusing on rebuilding the outer walls and infrastructure, and Dworkin devising new ways to use lyrium to make explosive concoctions. The new non-companion characters there are pivotal to one of the central conceits of Awakening, putting the player in control of the Grey Wardens and Vigil's Keep. Playing through Awakening for this video was my first time seeing the content at all, and as I started to realize what it was doing, I started getting really excited by the idea. I'm a big fan of strategy games and city builders, but I'm especially a fan of in-game housing. I'm not entirely sure why, to be honest, but whether it is the horribly bare-bones houses of Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, the real estate Empire of Fable 2, or the awesomely in-depth player housing found in the Elder Scrolls Online, I can't get enough of it. I love being able to customize them, using them to show off elements of my character's achievements, and just having a place in the game world to call my own. Now, I wasn't expecting Awakening to have an extremely intricate system to manage the Wardens and customize Vigil's Keep, but I was hoping for at least something similar to a cross between the parallel systems found in Fable 3 or Overlord 2. I hope that it would at least give the player some dichotomous decisions for light resource management that could impact the game's choice-based results while giving the player some different cosmetic options, like different thrones, rugs, or maybe a bookshelf or two. But it really under-delivers. A couple times throughout the expansion, the player is tasked with making some difficult decisions of how the Grey Wardens are going to use their strained resources, usually coming down to where to send the keep's limited supply of soldiers and guards. But there's no numerical value for these decisions that the player can see at any point. So rather than having to actually weigh the pros and cons of every decision, you end up just saying yes to anyone who asks for soldiers because you can't see how many you started with, how many you are giving away, or how many you have left afterward. I never denied anyone soldiers throughout the expansion, and it didn't seem to have any negative effect. This may have been because of how I completed all of the keep's upgrades. These upgrades are the closest that Awakening gets to allowing the player to customize their new digs, even though they don't change how it looks at all. Instead, they constitute finding new resource deposits to better provision your soldiers, finding quarries to rebuild the walls properly, funding repairs, and sealing tunnels to the dark roads beneath Vigil's Keep. This was especially disappointing to me as it completely misses out on all the potential of giving the player a keep to be in charge of. Getting the upgrades doesn't change anything at all. You can't even tell the difference when you get every upgrade, beyond an achievement popping. In fact, Awakening seems shy to show the player most of Vigil's Keep at all, making it feel like the fake facade of a tavern on the set of a Western film rather than a real building or location. Of the entire keep, all the player gets to explore is the courtyard, where there are a few merchants, and the main hall, where the player can talk to companions and make decisions regarding complaints of the common folk. Vigil's Keep is, overall, a complete letdown. Once the Grey Wardens have control of Vigil's Keep, the player has to hold court to meet the Arls and nobles of the area surrounding Amaranthine. This presents the player with their first ruling decision, whether to send soldiers to defend the city of Amaranthine proper, or to dedicate them to protecting the lowly farm folk. Eat the rich, so I go with protecting the farmers. Once that is taken care of, the Warden Commander is tasked with investigating the strange Darkspawn happenings in the area. Oh, and I almost forgot. While taking back Vigil's Keep, the player runs into a Darkspawn that closely resembles a human, and can fucking talk, so that's pretty crazy. Obviously something weird is going on, and the Warden Commander is pointed toward 3 nearby regions where there are situations to look into. The nearby Wending Wood is blocking local trade routes because of caravans being attacked. The abandoned dwarven fortress of Kal Haral has sundered open to become a dangerous doorway from the deep roads to the surface, and the swamp Black Marsh has become inhospitable because of a thinning between the material world and the Fade. This structure sets up the classic BioWare narrative web that allows the player to tackle a list of loosely connected objectives before coming together at the end to continue the main quest. For the expansion, this also establishes its 4 main areas, with the player also being able to check out Amaranthine for side quests and resupplies. With that in mind, each of the areas follows a pretty similar structure. They each offer the player a new companion, contain a short self-contained story to play through, and have a cluster of side quests that can be completed simultaneously to get those sweet new levels. I first decided to go to Black Marsh, so let's just start there. The investigation into Black Marsh begins with the Warden Commander attempting to track down a missing warden named Kristoff that went missing in the area. While exploring, the Warden Commander discovers that areas of the map are actually blocked off because of solid energy forming barricades by coming through the veil to escape the Fade. Evidence of Kristoff's passing through the area can also be found, like an old camp and some tracks. Eventually, the Warden Commander finds Kristoff's corpse in a small clearing, only to be ambushed by a group of Darkspawn that killed him. One of them is capable of speech and goes by the name of The First. He talks to the player briefly before taking out an orb that allows him to send the player and their party to the Fade. After waking in the Fade, however, the Warden Commander discovers that the First was brought to the Fade as well, much to the First's surprise. He makes some weird mentions of some character known as the Mother, and then runs away to try and find his own way back to the material world. From there, the player is able to explore an interesting interpretation of the Fade that differs quite a bit from how it is presented in Origins. Namely, the map is identical to Black Marsh itself, requiring players to work their way back through the now familiar terrain to the abandoned village of the swamp. Along the way, players can also find desire demons performing rituals that are the cause for the veil barriers in the material world, allowing them to kill those demons and to open up the sections of the map, which is a fun touch. Back at the village, the Warden Commander finds the spirits of the town's villagers trapped in the Fade by a demon that has manifested as the long-dead aristocrat of Black Marsh, the Baroness. However, she is opposed by a spirit going by the name of Justice, that is attempting to lead the villagers in an open revolt when the player arrives. He requests the Warden Commander's aid in leading the rebellion, and I love the sound of a rich girl soul sandwich, so I agree. Inside the courtyard of the Baroness's estate, it is revealed that the First is working with the Baroness on the promise of being sent back to the material world in exchange for his help. The Baroness instructs him to kill the player and spirits for her, and a fight breaks out. We win because the First isn't jack shit compared to a Blight, resulting in him begging the Baroness to send him back to the material world to save his life. She does the opposite, however, and uses him as fuel for a blood magic spell that sends herself, the player's party, and Justice to the material world. Since Justice is a spirit born in the Fade, however, he can only maintain a corporeal form in the material world by inhabiting the corpse of Kristoff, adopting some of his memories in the process, but we'll cover Justice in more detail in a little bit here. Back in the material world, the player and Justice travel back to the real world, ruins of the Baroness's estate. There they find the Baroness somehow maintaining a physical form. She transforms into a hulking pride demon, and the fight for Black Marsh begins. The fight isn't too hard, especially not with Justice's help, and once it is over, Black Marsh is freed from the demon's malignant power. However, her death does leave Justice without a clear focus or point to his life. He finds himself in an alien world with rules and customs he just doesn't understand. He knows nobody and doesn't have a clear way of learning how he should leave. So we recruit him to our cause, to deliver the justice that he values so highly to all that require it throughout Amaranthine, especially any darkspawn we come across during our travels. After Black Marsh is completed, the player is shown a cutscene of the Mother, a massive brood mother that rages at the first being killed, to another talking darkspawn before she swears vengeance on the Warden Commander. From Black Marsh we head to Wending Wood, where trade caravans have been getting ambushed and ransacked so much that all trade to the region has been horribly stifled. The player isn't really sure what is attacking the merchant caravans in the Wending Wood when they head there, but upon arriving it quickly becomes clear that it is the work of a Dalish mage named Vallana. At first she is willing to let the player into the region unmolested, as long as they leave her alone and deal with the local darkspawn like a Grey Warden should. But she makes it clear that a single misstep will see the Warden Commander being attacked by Sylvans, just like the merchants have been. While the player is investigating the darkspawn presence within the woods, however, they find evidence of a Dalish camp that was once led by Vallana, but seems to have been attacked by humans. However, the evidence implicating the humans is suspiciously obvious, with human weapons just piled on the ground and a sword even purposefully stabbed into the dirt near the camp as an unmissable signal. It definitely seems like something is up, and the player's suspicions are confirmed when they find a human soldier lying near an abandoned camp in the throes of death. He is able to talk briefly, however, giving him just enough time to report to the Warden Commander that the camp was swarmed by a group of darkspawn. After some questioning, he also tells the Warden Commander that the humans never interacted with the Dalish, but that he noticed the darkspawn were collecting human weaponry in a way uncharacteristic of the species. With that information, the Warden Commander is able to piece together what seems to have happened. The darkspawn, under some unusually intelligent leadership, attacked the human camp and took the equipment there, only to attack the nearby Dalish camp and leave the equipment behind, effectively pinning the blame on the humans to weaponize the furious Dalish without them knowing. With that information, the player can approach Vallana and reveal the truth to her, only to learn that she has been particularly furious because of her sister Serani being kidnapped when the camp was attacked. She then assumes that if the darkspawn were behind the attack, that they must have Serani in their clutches as well, pushing her to join the Warden Commander to venture into nearby Silverite mines in search of the darkspawn responsible. One interesting thing to note here is that I actually explored the mines before getting to this point in the area's story. So in my footage here, you'll see that I don't actually have Vallana in my party while in the mines, despite her being a mandatory party member after figuring out what happened to the camp of Dalish elves. When the player's party enters a Silverite mine, they are almost immediately ambushed by a speaking darkspawn known as the Architect, using a magical trap, which leads to them all being imprisoned deeper within the mine. The Architect seems to be the individual behind the talking darkspawn that are all the rage lately, as he seems like a highly intelligent and poised hybrid of a traditional human and a darkspawn. However, we'll have to wait a bit to learn more about what he all has going on in this story. The party wakes up in cells deep within the winding tunnels of the abandoned mine, but they are able to pretty easily make their way out. This leaves the party to fight their way out of the mine while getting an ominous peek behind the Architect's operation. They discover that he has been kidnapping humans, elves, and dwarves to perform unknown experiments on them, with failures becoming zombie-esque ghouls. The Warden Commander also eventually discovers that the Architect did kidnap Serani, but he was able to somehow convert her to his side, preventing her from leaving him to return with Vallana. Eventually, just before leaving the mine, the player is tested with fighting two dragons enthralled by the Architect, as well in a fight that I can only describe as an annoying series of crowd control effects that make me want to scream. With that, Vallana is recruited, and the player is able to leave the Wending Wood behind with a new companion and trade restored to the region. Before we entirely move on, however, I want to talk about a character the player comes across right before they fight with the two dragons named Armas. Armas is a merchant that for some reason thought it was an advisable idea to trade with the Darkspawn, although he doesn't seem to be in any danger when the player finds him. One of the tasks the player is given when they take over Vigil's Keep, though, is to recruit merchants to come and trade there to bolster its internal economy. But throughout the entire DLC, there are only two of them to find, Armas and Lilith, who is only found through a scripted random encounter where the player rescues her from bandits. I completed every quest in the expansion and never got to that scripted event, so I ended up only being able to recruit Armas, and it just seems like such a horrible, idiotic idea. Judgments of his own intelligence aside, I wouldn't trust anyone that is found just hanging out around Darkspawn, especially if they manage to do so without being captured or killed by them. How could you not be suspicious of that? Especially when he comes after you just met Serani, who, on the surface, appears like a perfectly normal elf while actually being mentally beholden to the architect's whims. Armas could easily be in an identical situation, but the expansion never questions the weird discovery, making it really feel like the developers just needed to dump a second merchant somewhere and weren't sure where to fit him into the expansion's areas in a novel way. With the Wending Wood sorted, we have only one of the 3 leads left to investigate, the fissure in the ground that opens up to Kal Harol. When the Warden Commander first investigates the fissure that opened up, they run into an injured dwarf woman that is a member of the Legion of the Damned, named Sigrun. Sigrun tells them that her unit was attacked by Darkspawn and brutally massacred. She isn't sure why she was left alive, but she is eager to take the opportunity to get revenge for her fallen comrades. So, we let her into the crew and delve once again into the Deep Roads to see what is up. Things are immediately strange when the Warden Commander enters and discovers that the Darkspawn are fighting one another, helping put together the puzzle pieces to deduce that the species is currently fractured, with one subfaction being led by the Architect and the other the Mother. A Darkspawn is a Darkspawn, though, so we chop our way through both sides of the conflict without prejudice. Kal Harol is relatively light on story because the area is functionally one dungeon that runs through an abandoned dwarven thag. The dungeon itself is a lot of fun, and has some really cool details for players to pick up on while they cover it in blood, but there isn't much to talk about a series of encounter rooms. Eventually, the player makes their way to the dungeon's boss fight, a colossal inferno golem that spews fire and is generally pretty intimidating. Once he is dealt with, the Warden Commander discovers why the Architect was laying siege to the Thag in the first place. It just so happens that it is a breeding ground for the Mother, with multiple brood mothers being found at the bottom of a pit to produce more Darkspawn. This kicks off another brief fight with the party cutting down broodmother tentacles to reach chains that anchor a floating lyrium well above them, cutting it down so that it crashes and kills the mother's follower production. With Kal Harol finished up, the player is ready to return to Vigil's Keep and start the final act of awakening. When the Warden Commander returns, they arrive just in time to receive a messenger, warning of forces from the Mother that are marching on the city of Amaranthine. This forces the Warden Commander's hand to take what soldiers they can muster and go defend the city, while leaving a small contingent of their companions and wardens behind to defend Vigil's Keep in their absence. When they eventually reach Amaranthine, though, they find the city almost already fallen. The local defense forces are despondent, Darkspawn roam the streets, and the player is advised to return to their keep and leave the city to burn as a last attempt at a Pyrrhic victory. This advice is further compounded when a talking Darkspawn is sent to the Warden Commander by the Architect to inform them that the Mother's forces are also marching on Vigil's Keep. The Architect implores them to return to the keep to defend it, and join forces with him to go and kill the Mother for good. At this point, the player doesn't really know what the Architect is all about, but it is still a pretty tempting offer. However, those upgrades to Vigil's Keep that I mentioned a little while ago heavily play into your decision here, if you know what is going on in the background. The player can only decide to defend one of the two locations, with the other being destroyed in their absence, and everyone there being killed in the process. This can only be avoided if the player has fully upgraded Vigil's Keep and decides instead to defend Amaranthine. In that case, the city is saved, and while the keep is destroyed, it bounces back quickly, and the companions left behind all make it through the siege alive. I do really appreciate that there is a reward for players that take the time to gather resources and prepare themselves, but I wish there was a similar option if the player had dedicated more attention to Amaranthine. Without there being an option to stay at Vigil's Keep but allow Amaranthine to survive through preparation, it ends up feeling like there is only one quote-unquote right way to finish the expansion, which is completely antithetical to the design ethos of Origins. I didn't know all of this ahead of time, but I was already at Amaranthine and knew that Vigil's Keep was as prepared as it could be, so I opted to stay and fight where I was. This leads to the player running around the small loop of Amaranthine streets to kill the Darkspawn still in the city, before fighting off an additional wave that arrives with the general. The fights here are pretty anticlimactic, except for the new armored ogre enemies that can be a real bitch to deal with. Once the general leading the attack on Amaranthine is killed, the Warden Commander decides the fate of the Architect's messenger, and then they make their final move against the Mother in an area called Drake's Fall, deep inside of a decrepit ruin left behind by the Tevinter Imperium. The section is a series of fights against numerous Darkspawn and children, while also having the option to power up 3 Tevinter artifacts that unlock powerful abilities to use while facing off against the Mother. Oh, wait, I guess I haven't talked about the children at all yet, have I? The children are a new form of Darkspawn introduced in Awakening. They are born from the Mother and bring a nice injection of dead space to Dragon Age. They also come in multiple forms. The first is the Child or Grub, a large larval form where they skitter about on bony legs and tackle targets to the ground before gnawing on them aggressively. After they've grown a bit or feasted upon a corpse, they grow into a child or hatchling. These enemies gain a new ability to attack with a flurry of strikes while standing up on long, gangly limbs and hunching over like Quasimodo in Isaac Clarke's Worst Nightmare. It doesn't end there, however, as they can also appear even more disturbing and powerful in the form of adult childers that fight identically but boast improved stats. It is really nice to see such a new class of enemies introduced for the expansion. They had a really great foil to the Architect and his Speaking Darkspawn by going in the opposite direction and making Darkspawn even more terrifying and monstrous. Speaking of the Architect, just before the player reaches the Mother, they run into him and a dwarf woman and ex-Grey Warden that is in his employ. During this conversation, the Architect attempts to convince the player to join his side, revealing his plan this entire time. In fact, working with the Warden Commander was his goal all along, and even when the group of Darkspawn attacked Vigil's Keep at the start of the expansion, they were originally sent as an envoy until the Wardens freaked out and attacked them on sight. So let's go over the Architect's plan. The Architect as a character is really fleshed out more in the prequel novel to Awakening titled The Calling. I'm planning on doing a 4th video in this series that covers all the franchise's other media products like comics, books, etc. So for now I'll just go over what is required to know to understand the character here, since the in-game conversation with him doesn't do the best job. So when the Architect was created, he had a strange mutation that made him immune to the song, the constant drawing power of that all Darkspawn hear, which draws them to the old gods used to start blights. The lack of the song allowed the Architect to reach intellectual levels equal to that of a human, while his tainted nature still allows him to interact with and even lead his Darkspawn brethren. With that extra brain power, and after watching the most recent Blight fail, he began to question the unending cyclical relationship the Darkspawn have with the surface world. Countless generations of his people were enslaved to the whims of the old gods, doomed to always throw their lives away in pointless massive fights against the surface world, without anything to gain and little to no hope of success. So, the Architect dedicated his life to finding a way to end the Blight, eventually hatching a plan. His plan is to make an alliance with the Grey Wardens to track down every remaining old god and kill them, theoretically freeing the Darkspawn from the Song for good. Then, he intends to allow the Darkspawn to live alongside the surface species, by exposing all living things in the world to the taint. This would undoubtedly cull the vast majority of living things, but he does have a point when he says that the deaths to do so would inevitably be less than an unending cycle of blights would eventually. So, at this point, just before fighting the Mother, the Architect explains this plan to the Warden Commander, and requests their agreement to help him kill the Mother in exchange for being let go to continue his work in peace, a way to finally end the blights for good, technically fulfilling the entire mission statement of the Grey Wardens. Now, there's definitely a good argument to be made for supporting the Architect's plan, but there's something in me that just can't jive with it. Massively killing off people with a process bordering on eugenics and trusting the crazy ideas of the Darkspawn that could very well be lying is just too big of a pill for me to swallow. And I take meds every morning. So I refuse his offer outright and instead have to kill him and his Grey Warden friend in what is honestly a disappointingly easy fight. However, he does drop some really solid gear for mage characters once he goes down for good. From there, the player goes on to fight the Mother, which is a much longer and harder fight than just about anything else in all of Origins. She is a massive and grotesque broodmother that repeatedly summons clusters of tentacles that appear from the ground to swat at the player's party. If the player activated the Tevinter relics or sided with the Architect, they can have a total of 4 one-time use abilities that can help keep them in the fight for longer, which is a great implementation and way to give the fight a unique element to consider. The fight takes a while, but eventually the Warden Commander is victorious, slaying the Mother and scattering the remaining Darkspawn back to the deep roads they had risen from. Once the Mother is killed, the player is shown some narrative wrap-up, and then Awakening is finished, and they are returned to the game's main menu. The wrap-up details the effects of the player's actions a bit, although they aren't very satisfying. especially since the player's actions don't have much of an effect. If the Architect is killed, he obviously is no more, but letting him go sees him disappearing into the Deep Roads too, as of yet, never be seen again despite other groups of Grey Wardens trying to hunt him down. The Grey Wardens in Ferelden also always end up getting established in the country, while the Warden Commander always just sort of wanders off to go and do something else in a possible sequel. I completely understand needing to get the world to a solid place for the sequels to build on, but Origins did a much better job of doing that while still leaving room for the player's choices and actions to matter and have an impact. This is even more important in a shorter experience like Awakening that doesn't have the length to have a player's actions impact their playthrough in the middle of it, rather than just at the end. Instead, all of the player's major decisions in Awakening happen at the climax, only to not really have a noticeable effect, making it feel much more linear than the base game. The expansion story also runs into the problem of feeling like it doesn't explain itself enough. Even with reading the prequel book before starting it, I was left with questions at the end. However, I do really like the structure of the expansion, with each of the 3 new areas having a small contained story to run through, and Amaranthine acting as a hub to go visit and resupply in between. So, Awakening ends up being a really great capstone to Origins. It plays around with the setting in some really cool ways, and its shorter runtime makes it a fun conclusion to finish the whole thing off. While I don't think that it is a necessary part of Origins for everyone to play, I also don't think that it is an experience that anyone will regret playing either. Before we take a look at the new companions introduced in Awakening, I want to jump to a more mechanical view to look at the new skills and specializations that the expansion adds. To start with, it introduces 3 new skills: Vitality, Clarity, and Rune Crafting. Vitality and Clarity give the character more health and mana respectively, making them really helpful for some characters and great for anyone who doesn't care about crafting. Rune Crafting is the more interesting one though, as it allows players to find and collect recipes or tracings that allow them to then craft their own weapon and armor runes. It also introduces a new tier of runes, allowing players to further upgrade themselves to overcome the game's new changes. The new skills here do well enough to add some new options to the expansion, with Rune Crafting in particular being fun to toy around with. Vitality and Clarity on their part are both fine and can help you beef up tank party members, but they do feel a tad underwhelming when compared to the more involved and varied skills available. On top of adding some new talents and spells for each class, Awakening also does a much better job of introducing new specializations, with each class receiving 2 options that can be unlocked through purchasing manuals. The Mage gets the Battle Mage and Keeper specializations, and oh boy do I love the Battle Mage. Battle Mages focus on getting up in the center fray of battle, and use area of effect abilities centered on their position to damage multiple enemies and keep their attention. One spell, Stoic, is especially good, as it allows Battle Mages to gain mana whenever they are dealt damage. The most exciting part of this specialization, though, is using it with the base game's Arcane Warrior specialization. Both of them can be pretty underwhelming and difficult to play around on their own, but with both of them on a single character, they create one of the most diverse and fun ways to play a mage by allowing them to fulfill a tank role for the party. The Keeper specialization is instead a Dalish mage that is highly attuned to nature and is responsible for guiding their tribes through the world. Mechanically, the specialization focuses on giving the mage some more survivability options, by giving them an immobilizing shield, healing them from dealing damage, and using area of effect spells to control enemy movement and maintain space. The specialization has a lot of cool effects and is fun, but it does feel a bit weird with the class receiving 2 elvish specializations. Although I guess they can't do a dwarven one, so it does make sense. Moving on to the Rogue, those Warden Commanders will also be able to choose from the Legionnaire Scout and Shadow specializations. The Legionnaire Scout is great just from the perspective of dwarves finally getting a cool specialization. Berserkers are fine, but the Legionnaire Scout is a lot more intriguing, especially since it has ties with a really interesting faction in the game's lore. The specialization focuses on giving rogues a ton more survivability, with multiple talents that just flat out allow them to ignore damage for a limited time. This plays a little weird with the rogue's baked-in playstyle, but I could see it being very useful for players that have a hard time keeping their rogues alive. The Shadow specialization is much less interesting. Flavor-wise, a Shadow Rogue is described as being an elite practitioner of a rogue's usual abilities, rather than giving it an in-world faction association. There's nothing wrong with this, but it does fail to capture the imagination when the rogue already has the duelist and assassination specializations with almost identical backgrounds. Its talents aren't much better. It has a decoy you can put down to distract enemies, a form to keep enemies disinterested in them, and a way to buff their backstab damage. Shadow Rogues aren't really bad, but it fails to introduce as much of an interesting new way to approach the class as Awakening's other new options. For Warriors, the expansion adds the Guardian and Spirit Warrior specializations. Guardians are built from the ground up to protect their allies from as much damage as possible, making it great for tanking in a party with 2 or 3 melee characters in it. Its talents allow the Guardian to give an ally a shield, buff the entire party with additional armor and stat boosts, and the ability to bring enemies back by the Guardian if they attempt to flee. The specialization helps fill in some of the gaps in tanks in Origins, making them much more universally effective throughout fights. It is especially impactful when it comes to keeping the entire party alive, whereas in Origins, many tanks just end up being the last party member alive thanks to their survivability. The Spirit Warrior is much more interesting when it comes to lore. It allows the warrior to augment their abilities by making brief deals with spirits from the Fade, granting them boons without opening themselves up long enough to be possessed or tainted in some way, at least ideally. Its talents focus around a sustained talent known as Beyond the Veil. By progressing through the talent line, it increases the warrior's chance of dodging attacks, increasing their resistance to enemy spells, and attacking even faster. In addition, they also gain a talent that allows them to burst spirit energy outward from themselves, to deal damage to all nearby enemies. Its mechanics don't end up feeling very revolutionary, but the flavor that comes with it is just really great. Its focus on the Beyond the Veil's sustained talent also allows it to work really well with just about any other specialization, but I really like it with Reaver, since that also deals with the Fade. The specializations in Awakening are undoubtedly a mixed bag, but the way that they expand the scope and flavor of each class is exactly what I want to see. This may not age well, but it does make me excited to see how the combat is expanded on in Dragon Age 2, especially when it comes to classes and their specializations. With that, let's end like we did for the base game by taking a look at the companions in Dragon Age: Origins-Awakening. I want to start with Ogryn, since he is the only one recurring from the base game. The last the player had heard of Ogryn, he rekindled a romance with Felsi, and ended up having a child with her. However, at the start of Awakening, he has traveled to Vigil's Keep on a whim to try and become a Grey Warden. Through talking with him, the player can learn that he did so because he doesn't believe he is worthy of being a father or husband after falling off the wagon and starting to drink again, eventually resulting in him dropping his young child. Eventually, Felsi shows up at Vigil's Keep to confront him about leaving his family behind. The confrontation doesn't produce much between the two, but once the Warden Commander gets close enough with Ogryn, they have the opportunity to convince him to take a more active role in the lives of his family. Otherwise, they can also convince him not to, resulting in him just wandering into the world looking for things to hit if he survives the end of the expansion. One aspect of Ogryn that I find particularly interesting is the fact that some players may end up killing him in Origins. This can happen if he reaches the maximum negative approval of the player throughout the game, resulting in him fighting them to the death. However, he will still show up in Awakening, giving the Warden a compliment for the well-done fight and reporting that he had woken up with all of his possessions missing after the duel. His character arc throughout the expansion is interesting and very serious, but in a well-measured way. I'm not a fan of the game playing fast and loose with his fate in Origins, but I understand why the developers thought it was necessary, and as long as characters coming back from the dead doesn't become a more common occurrence in the series, I'm okay with it here. Now, let's look at the first original companion in Awakening, Anders. The Warden Commander meets Anders when first chopping down Darkspawn in the halls of Vigil's Keep. When he is found, he is surrounded by dead Templars and smoothly transitions into cracking jokes about the situation. He is also very open with the fact that he is an apostate. This causes some issues during the expansion as Templars repeatedly try to apprehend Anders, which the player can opt to either allow or prevent. This is even the subject of his personal quest. The quest starts with Anders and the Warden Commander running into one of the apostate's old friends when they approach him and say that they know where Anders' phylactery is. This is obviously huge, so he asks the Warden Commander for help hunting it down and destroying it to forever cut his ties to the Circle of Mages. When the player goes to where the friend claimed the phylactery was, however, it turns out to have been a trap set by some Templars. I don't have a good way to transition to this, so I also just want to mention that the player can also find a kitten and give to him to keep as a pet, which he names Sir Pouncelot, which is fucking awesome. Anders has a lot of Alistair in him. He is wisecracking, irreverent, blonde, and comes with an interesting and intense backstory. However, I think he plays a lot better than Alistair now. His sense of humor lands more consistently for me. His backstory has more interesting layers and weight to it, while not feeling as archetypical as a long-lost prince returning to reclaim his throne. I don't think there's anything wrong with preferring Alistair, especially since players get a lot more time to build a relationship with him, but in this case, I'm all Team Anders. Anders also has a lot of different possible endings in Awakening. If he is handed over to the Templars, he continues to escape from them, only to be caught again and escape yet again, this time seemingly for good. Otherwise, he can also die defending Vigil's Keep, being found with an arrow in his neck and a ring of killed Darkspawn around him. If the Keep is fully upgraded, though, he is instead hailed as a hero for his magical influence over the battlefield, after which he gets in a drinking contest with some others and gets thoroughly stomped. Finally, if he is kept with the player during the climax of the expansion, he stays with the Wardens to train new mage recruits. However, he eventually feels that it is his time to leave the Wardens, and he goes on his way. Then there is also Justice, the strangest companion introduced in Awakening. He joins the Warden Commander during the story in Blackmarsh as a spirit of the Fade that is inhabiting the corpse of a Grey Warden killed in the line of duty. He is a complete fish out of water, having to slowly learn about the cultures and customs of Ferelden. It's the kind of concept that BioWare handles really well, and takes full advantage of the more strange elements of the fantastical setting. Similar to Legion from Mass Effect, Justice offers a chronically unique perspective on the world, allowing the game to challenge the player's perceptions and play around with the building blocks of the setting. He is a real standout of the expansion's cast, which makes it all the more disappointing that his companion quest is so lame. It begins when Justice first returns to Vigil's Keep and runs into Aura, the wife of the deceased warden whose body he inhabits. Aura is understandably horrified by what has happened to her husband, especially with the puppeting of his corpse. She lashes out at Justice and runs away, leaving him to wonder whether or not he should try to find her in Amaranthine and give her some comfort. The companion quest sees the player going to talk to Aura in the Chantry within the city. It consists of a quick conversation that doesn't really do anything with Justice's novel concept, and that's it. At the end of the expansion, Justice's fate is always left pretty ambiguous. If he defends Vigil's Keep without all the upgrades, Kristoff's head is cut off during the battle, leaving the spirit's fate unknown. Otherwise, most of his endings see him staying with the Wardens for a while before going to Aura's house only to leave the body, allowing it to drop to the floor like a corpse should. The only different endings is if the player never recruits him, whereupon he is believed to be behind whispered stories of a strange body in Grey Warden armor, putting up gravestones for those who died in Blackmarsh. That brings us to Nathaniel Howe. If that name seems a little sussy-gussy to you, good. It should, because he is none other than the son of Arl Rendon Howe, the same Arl Rendon Howe responsible for betraying the Kuslins and supporting Loghain in the base game. When the player meets Nathaniel, he is imprisoned in the dungeons of Vigil's Keep after he was arrested for attempting to steal some family heirlooms kept in the fortress. He is going to be put to death for his crimes, but the Warden Commander can instead opt to put his considerable skills to good use by invoking the right of conscription. Nathaniel's place in the party is really cool, especially if you're playing an imported character that had the human noble origin like I was. There are a lot of conversations between him and the player that are fraught with tension and great moments. His personality also fits right at home in the expansion. He is fun to be around, takes events seriously, and has a tight development arc of him finding a way to cope with his family's legacy while going on to find his own place and role in the world outside of it. His companion quest is also really cool. It starts with him recognizing his family's old groundskeeper in the courtyard of Vigil's Keep, who tells him that he has a sister that lived through the Blight and can be found in none other than Amaranthine. The quest is just as simple as Justice's, but its superior writing helps it feel more impactful and worthwhile. After talking with Delilah, the sister, she confirms that their father was responsible for his own actions during the Blight, lifting the weight off Nathaniel's shoulders and letting him come to grips with his family's stained legacy. It is emotional, heavy, and very satisfying, especially for how short it is. Like the other companions in Awakening, Nathaniel has a few different endings possible, but only a few. If he defends the keep without it being fully upgraded, he will die like most other companions, but he otherwise has a great ending. He can serve the Grey Wardens for a while before retiring, although this leads to his nephew eventually going on to become the Warden Commander of the Order in Ferelden. His other possible ending sees him striving out on his own, eventually saving Fergus Kusland and restoring the Howe name by making it associated with heroics instead of betrayal and insurrection. Then there is also the dwarven rogue Sigrun. Sigrun is the last living member of the contingent of the Legion of the Dead. She joins the Warden Commander after being saved from Darkspawn just outside the entrance of Kal Hirol. She is a very conflicted character, due to a large sense of survivor's guilt. Not only did she have to watch all of her friends die in front of her, but she survived serving a unit of dwarves that are intended to fight until they die. That is their duty. They are considered to be dead when they join the Legion, moving on to dedicate their deaths to killing some Darkspawn. And she failed at that. She lived when everyone else fulfilled their duty. This internal conflict brings up a lot of interesting ideas for players to explore through getting to know Sigrun. Her companion quest starts with the player travels to Amaranthine with a strong enough relationship with her. In the streets, the Warden Commander is approached by another dwarf named Misha, that she had been close to as a young dwarf. However, the two had a falling out after the Carta forced Sigrun to frame Misha for stealing a rare artifact. After the confrontation, the player can attempt to help Sigrun clear out some of the ridiculous amount of guilt in her conscience by amending the situation with Misha. This can be done in two ways, either giving Misha a gold ring from one of Sigrun's dead allies, or by paying her 20 sovereigns so that Sigrun can also keep her memento. Honestly, the quest is kinda just fine. It's disappointing how much of a habit Awakening has of having companion quests that are just 2 or 3 conversations, and this one ends up feeling like the absolute middle ground. It's short enough to not be annoying, but isn't interesting enough to really stand out or feel worthwhile either. At the end of Awakening, there are quite a few states that Sigrun can be left in. If the player largely ignores Sigrun and makes some decisions that she doesn't agree with, she ends up getting hopelessly depressed after killing the mother, going so far as to eventually leave in the middle of the night to wander the deep roads until her inevitable death. It is also possible for her to run into the deep roads before facing the mother, if she is with the player when they face the architect and they decide to spare him. However, this only happens if the player also didn't complete her companion quest beforehand, which is a pretty nice touch. Otherwise, she ends up staying with the Grey Wardens for a while, during which she was kept in good spirits and would frequently joke about her need to go and die in the deep roads, even occasionally going so far as to leave Vigil's Keep for a time, although she always comes back eventually. Finally, if the player never recruits Sigrun to begin with, she ventures back into the deep roads to die as a legionnaire of the dead should, only to be found years later still alive, alone, and talking about her unending need to die. This brings us to the final companion, Velana. Velana is a Dalish mage that is recruited by the Warden Commander in the Wending Wood, which I won't reiterate since this video is long enough. To put it simply, I really disliked having Velana around. As a character, she largely serves as the personification of Dalish anger and resentment, as a consequence of their treatment for generations. Her feelings in that regard are completely valid. I can't even imagine the amount of emotional trauma that she must be burdened with, and pretty much everything she says regarding the issue is spot on. That being said, her constant vitriol, complaints, and anger are not at all fun to be around. Regardless of how cognizant her points, the way she is written fails to help her still engage with the plot or show any other qualities of her personality, at least for the majority of the time she is with the player. This leaves her feeling like the player in a Dungeons & Dragons game that has a really tragic backstory and won't talk about anything else. It doesn't even make sense for their character to be in the party in the first place, but every other player is forced to contort their experience around their self-centered play. That's Velana through and through, but with more personal insults and attacks mixed in for good measure. Her companion quest is introduced during a structured random encounter where the party is approached by members of Velana's previous Dalish clan that she was exiled from. However, it doesn't really provide any sense of closure or development. Instead, the scene happens and the player can talk to Velana to learn more about what happened, fumbling the opportunity for her character to have any growth or development. Even her relationship with her sister Sarani is left unexplored. After meeting Sarani in the Wending Wood, the player can only run into her again by bringing Velana along to Drake's Fall in the expansion's final quest. The two have a conversation then, but it doesn't have any resolution or momentum. Sarani compares the Darkspawn with the Dalish and then disappears, leaving Velana just as confused as the player. Her endings in Awakening are also unsatisfying. If she is left to defend Vigil's Keep on her own, she is seemingly crushed by rubble, but her body is never found, regardless of how many upgrades the player prepares ahead of time. Otherwise, she can stay with the Wardens for a while, only to run into the dark labyrinth of the Deep Roads after thinking that she sees Sarani out of the corner of her eye. It is possible to change her mind regarding humanity if the Warden Commander develops a close enough relationship with her, but it is also possible for her ending to be nothing more than blaming the player for keeping her from ever seeing her sister again, ending your relationship with her in an appropriately sour note. I believe that when fantasy is at its best, it serves as a vehicle to explore topics and themes relative to the real world in a unique way. For Dragon Age Origins, it explores fear. Every layer of its world and story is dedicated to exploring the nature of fear and how it affects those stuck within it. Mages are strictly controlled and monitored out of fear for the power they wield. Loghain betrays the son of his best friend and the figurehead of the country he has dedicated his life to out of fear of the king's incompetence. The Darkspawn threat itself is the pinnacle of this theme. The world of Thedas can never afford to not be afraid of the Darkspawn. It's an omnipresent threat to the world's existence that always exists just beneath the world's surface. They cannot be reasoned with. Nobody knows when another blight will begin, and they are a vicious mockery of humanity itself. What really makes the thematic elements of Origins feel so fun to explore, though, is how it builds on those individual elements to explore more facets of its themes. The innate fear of the Darkspawn is an interesting way to look at the very human experience of existential fear and dread, but the game also uses it to explore how people repeat that fear. There are those who attempt to reject it outright, countless NPCs that don't view the Blight as a legitimate threat and don't want to dedicate their resources to fighting it. But then there are also those who react to fear by looking for a savior to deliver them from it, the player character. Now, the role of the player character in any video game is an interesting dynamic in any setting, with a necessary balance between verisimilitude and player empowerment. This makes it very interesting in games like Origins, where one is put into a position of power where they are the only person who can save the world. There are a few instances throughout Origins that directly interact with this thematic element, but the game's entire moral system does inherently as well. This might be my favorite thing about Origins. Its world and stories that it offers players are so well written that they work on every level. The story is engaging and varied enough that it stands on its own throughout multiple playthroughs, but also uses its bones to put players in challenging situations that make them think about things. From moral principles to philosophical ideas and interpersonal drama, Origins is able to take you through the highs and lows of the human experience. Playing through Origins now, so many years after I originally became obsessed with it, has been just an awesome experience. It always feels great to return to something that you have a ton of nostalgia for and find that it has aged extremely well. Playing through Awakening was particularly fun since I never had before, and moving forward with the series has me terribly excited, even after all of the negative things I have heard about Dragon Age 2. So, thank you so much for watching, especially since this is a new channel and this is a really long video. In the future, I plan on doing more long-form video essays like this, as well as some slightly shorter form videos, particularly focusing on narratives in video games. So, if you would like to continue on this journey with me through Dragon Age, please subscribe, and I'll see you guys back in Thedas, hopefully soon.